history does not constitute a high crime or misdemeanor.
I think that
he has presented no argument on that question. He has presented no briefing on that question.
So we can get the beginning of Ted Cruz's.
Madam President, I rise to make a motion. The Majority Leader has argued that Secretary Mayorkas' defiance of federal immigration law and active aiding and abetting of the worst criminal invasion in our nation's history does not constitute a high crime or misdemeanor. He has presented no argument on that question. He has presented no briefing on that question, and the position is directly contrary to the Constitution, to the original understanding of the Constitution at the time it was ratified, and to the explicit position of the Biden Department of Justice as argued before the Supreme Court of the United States. The Majority Leader's position is asking members of this Senate to vote on political expediency to avoid listening to arguments. The only rational way to resolve this question is actually to debate it, to consider the Constitution and consider the law.
The Senator will recognize that the Senate is in a non-debatable position. The Senator has a right to offer his point of order, or his motion, but we are in a non-debatable position.
And my motion is to change that so that we can actually debate the law if senators care what the Constitution and law says. I therefore move that the Senate proceed to closed session to allow for deliberation on the question as required by Impeachment Rule 24.
Madam President,
Majority Leader.
In our previous consent request, we gave your side a chance for debate in public, where it should be, and your side objected. We are moving forward.
Wow.
The question is on the motion.
Ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown.
So,
Mr.
sorry,
Budd.
I'm just a little shocked.
Ms. Butler.
It's shocking that they're not even,
Ms. Cantwell.
or that Schumer is really
Mrs.
pulling the rug
Capito.
out from the whole thing. Or, I mean, maybe there is some sort of
Cardin.
parliamentary mechanism. I don't know.
Mr. Carper.
Look,
Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy.
it seems as though everybody's bracing
Collins.
for this thing to get tabled.
Mr. Coons.
So,
Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton.
this is the most people
Kramer.
I've seen in the Senate. Because usually when
Mr.
you tune in,
Crapo.
it's no one. It's the
Mr.
one person
Cruz.
speaking. Maybe a few
Mr.
people
Daines.
putting
Ms.
around.
Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst.
Welcome in, chat. What's
Mr.
going on,
Fetterman.
everybody? This is, let me pin
Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand.
the
Mr. Graham.
Senate
Mr. Grassley.
impeachment
Mr. Haggerty.
trial.
Ms. Hassan.
Can you hear my keyboard?
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Rono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Heidsmith.
Alejandro Mayorkas.
Mr. Johnson.
There we go.
Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly.
That
Mr. Kennedy.
never was, question
Mr.
mark.
King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey.
Guessing we're going right down party lines.
Mr. Marshall.
I haven't been listening too carefully.
Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney.
Anybody keeping track?
Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio.
They all look so happy
Mr.
to be
Sanders. Mr. Schatz.
there. Can't
Mr.
believe they're
Schmidt.
making us do our jobs for a few minutes.
Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida.
That's
Mr.
the real
Scott of South
reason.
Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms.
They don't
Sinema.
want to go through with this impeachment trial, so they'd all
Ms.
have
Smith.
to sit there and listen
Ms.
to it.
Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis.
Come on in, like
Mr.
and
Tuberville.
subscribe.
Mr. Van
It
Hollen.
would help. New channel,
Mr. Vance.
newish
Warner.
channel.
Mr. Warnock.
Signed up
Ms. Warren.
to YouTube 5 years ago.
Welch.
Social Blade told me. Didn't know that.
Mr. Whitehouse.
It took a couple swings,
Wicker.
but never really serious. But this is
Mr. Wyden.
my first
Mr.
good
Young.
swing at it. So if you subscribe, that would help, and thank you. For all the people that already are, thank you. Blew my mind. A lot of lawyers cover trials and lawyerly things and you know, like this is what to do when you get pulled over and don't talk to the cops and, you know, don't consent to breathalyzer, and they don't tell you that you're going to lose your license for a year if you don't consent to the breathalyzer. Or maybe they do tell you that. I don't know. But not a lot of them are covering politics. I mean, and the news isn't covering it. So that's why I'm covering it. How do I feel about current ATF? I mean, I don't know who the ATF leadership is, but I don't like the ATF or any number of government agencies that are existing right now. I'm like, you know, the Argentinian, the new president there? He's like, afuera! I'm a big fan of afuera. You know? Bunch of agencies and bureaus. Like, I don't know who the leadership is. And maybe they're good guys, maybe they're good leaders. I don't know. Maybe they're terrible and that's what you're looking for. I'm not sure. But, you know, I'm a small government guy, and ATF gots to go. Sorry, that's not very lawyerly of me. I think the ATF should be among one of several government agencies that should be very carefully looked at to be afuera. Sorry. Afuera. Motion to proceed to a closed session. So what they're saying is maybe we don't get to see what happens next. And then they'll come back and then they'll say, okay, we had our closed session and now we're going to vote to table it. Ah, God, if that happens. And so we have, I don't know if you can see this. I can see it. There's a clock. So I'm guessing that's where we're at, and we're pretty close. Now we're live. It's 9. We were only 20 seconds delayed, and that wasn't on purpose. Although sometimes I do like a delay. Only because some of them talk so slow, and then you can make it speed up a little bit, or if you just don't want to hear what they have to say, you can just skip. Skip it! I mean, in the meantime, I can show you guys some of my dank videos. That's what you want to do, right? I don't even know where I would begin. The content. So what's pertinent to, okay. Wait, are
The
we?
nays are 51, the yeas are 49, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. The pending order is the motion made by the majority leader on the point of order.
So Cruz
Madam
got
President.
defeated.
Senator from Louisiana.
Yes, that's
Madam
Kennedy.
President, I have a motion. I think my motion takes precedent. Having heard Senator Schumer's serious allegations, which in my judgment are
He got a
specious,
haircut.
about the constitutionality of these impeachment proceedings, we find ourselves in the awkward position, because we're in impeachment proceedings, of being unable to discuss in public the merits of Senator Schumer's claim, and at the same time, my Democratic friends have refused to go into closed session, so we can discuss them.
Will
So
the
for that
senator
reason,
please-
Madam President, I move we adjourn this court of impeachment immediately until 12 o'clock noon on Tuesday, April 30th, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There
What
is a sufficient second. The
is
clerk will call the roll.
strategy about?
Ms. Baldwin.
There's not what I saw coming from Kennedy.
Mr. Barrasso.
There's a reason for it. I just don't know.
Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman.
I see you wobbly.
Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler.
So he wants to adjourn
Ms.
until later
Cantwell.
at the end of the month.
Mrs. Capito.
What would that do? Just allow
Mr.
things.
Carden. Mr.
Allow them
Carper.
time to try to get a few more votes.
Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn.
This is actually
Ms.
a little bit of a
Cortez
twist.
Masto.
What do you say? How do you say?
Cotton.
Oh
Mr.
boy.
Kramer.
My dogs have something to say about it.
Mr. Crapo.
Um,
Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines.
how did Cruz
Ms.
vote on
Duckworth.
that one?
Mr. Durbin.
You can barely hear.
Ms.
Even without
Ernst.
me jabbering and jawing,
Mr. Fetterman.
and even without the music,
Mrs. Fisher.
Mr. Fetterman gave us some serious thought.
Mrs. Gillibrand.
I actually have grown to
Mr.
like
Graham.
Fetterman. I mean, he said a
Mr.
lot of
Grassley.
things that make sense.
Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan.
And then every
Mr.
once
Hawley.
in a while, you know,
Mr.
nothing.
Heinrich.
It's just not making sense. But
Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane.
this group,
Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King.
So right now, if you're just joining us,
Klobuchar.
Senator Kennedy, young man from
Mr.
Louisiana,
Langford.
and I'm just kidding. He's a little advanced there,
Mr.
but
Lee.
he's a character.
Mr.
I don't
Lujan.
even know. He reminds me of a cross
Ms.
between
Lummis.
Tasmanian devil
Manchin.
and Foghorn
Mr. Markey.
Leghorn. So, you know.
Mr. Marshall.
Anyway,
Mr. McConnell.
he just put to vote whether or not they should adjourn
Menendez.
until April, the end of April.
Mr.
Was it?
Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen.
I don't know his exact reasons, but I think
Murkowski.
it's just to avoid
Mr. Murphy.
getting the thing tabled
Mrs.
right
Murray.
now, which looks
Mr.
like it's the
Ossoff.
direction that it's heading in.
Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts.
Schumer, I
Mr. Risch.
do not like.
Mr. Romney.
And
Ms.
again,
Rosen.
in my travels, I don't think I've met
Rounds.
too many people that like
Mr.
Schumer.
Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen.
What's going on,
Mr.
chat?
Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
I think Young's the last one. Will they actually impeach, though? It doesn't seem like it. So right now, the last thing that happened was Senator Kennedy put to vote whether or not they should adjourn just to avoid tabling the whole thing. And it looks like they're really working to table it. I don't know how this vote went down, but it seemed like it went down to not adjourn. and I think they're tallying right now. It's not going to take, there's a clock ticking off, but it's not going to take that time to tally. I think they're just tallying up right now. I think. Because what I've come to realize is this. They don't want to be there any longer than they have to be. Now, they could have voted to adjourn, which, is goes against my theory. But then they would have to pick up where they left off later, and so they would still have to go through this tabling process later, which they just want to table, get back to eating hors d'oeuvres at cocktail parties and fundraising. That reminds me, you actually have to call your congressman if you're doing stuff with the federal government. Like, say you want to represent soldiers at the VA when they get denied maybe a claim or something. Put a form into the government. It should take a few weeks, maybe a few months. It just doesn't. They don't get to it ever unless you call your congressman and they apply pressure. It's broken. It's broken. How's everybody doing? So I did an answer in typing form. Looks like no. Just to type it and have it there for the record. Okay. It's too bad. It would have been a salacious, trial. Would have been fun to watch. There would have been clippable moments. Instead, we're going to have to watch Schumer say something to the effect of, I put to vote to table these unfounded charges brought here by the House of Representatives. Something like that. Listen, I can do these impressions, okay? 70% of me can. And the other 30% of me could do the Lucky Charms. Okay. All right. Looks like they counted it. She's bringing the tally. Yep. And the president is reading.
On this vote, the yeas are 49, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to.
Madam President.
The Republican leader is recognized.
The Senate just swore an oath to do impartial justice according to the Constitution and the laws of our country. We swore to discharge a duty that is quite different from our normal work. As a court of impeachment, we're called not to speak, not to debate, but to listen, both to the case against the accused and to his defense.
He actually
At
looks
this point,
better than he did
in
this
any
morning.
trial in the country,
Terrible this
the
morning.
prosecution presents the evidence of the case. Counsel for the defense does the same.
That was close,
The
but it's
jury
pretty much
remains
the
silent
party line divide in the
as it
Senate.
listens.
I forget how it goes.
This is what our
I think there's a
rules
few independents that
require
caucus with
of us
Democrats. I
as
think that's
well.
how it goes.
But the Senate has not had the opportunity to perform this duty. The Senate will not hear the House managers present the details of their case against Secretary Mayorkas, that he willingly neglected the duties of his office and that he lied to Congress about the extent
Now
of
the
that
question is,
failure.
did McConnell go up to
Likewise,
Schumer
we will not
prior
hear
to
the
this and be like, you know, I
Secretary's
have to say
representatives
something, and Schumer was like,
present
yeah,
the
I know,
vigorous
I know.
defense to which he's entitled.
Still gonna table
Our
the whole
colleagues
thing.
know that
That's a
we are
terrible Schumer
obligated
impression. Listen,
to take these
not a comedian.
proceedings seriously. This is what our oath prescribes. It's what the history and precedent require. And I would urge each of our colleagues to consider that this
Yeah, the
is
good
what
question.
the
The
framers
allegations
actually envisioned.
are
The power of impeachment
specific
is one of the
allegations.
most delicate balances
The
our
breach of
constitutional
public
system
trust
strikes
is one of them,
with a
and
portion of the
then
American people's
like a
sovereign
systemic failure,
electoral
a
authority.
willful and systemic
It purchases a safeguard
like failure to
against
follow the
malpractice,
law.
and it gives the Senate the power
So,
and the duty to decide.
It's complicated.
This process
Anecdotally,
must not be
shooting from the
abused.
hip,
It must not be
it seems like
short-circuited.
there's a big failure, and
History will not
there's definitely a
judge
breach of the
this
public
moment
trust.
well. Therefore, I move
Willful
to table the point of order and ask
systemic.
for the ayes and nays.
Those
Is there a
elements could be
sufficient
met.
second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Sorry, I missed the.
Mr. Barrasso.
See, we can actually just go back to
Mr.
see
Bennett.
what he asked them to vote on, and then speed it back up.
Actually envisioned. The power of impeachment is one of the most delicate balances our constitutional system strikes.
So we went back
With a
about a
portion of the
minute,
American people's
speeding it
sovereign
up to
electoral
1.5.
authority.
We'll catch up.
It purchases a safeguard against malpractice, and it gives the Senate the power and the duty to decide. This process must not be abused. It must not be short-circuited. History will not judge this moment well. Therefore, I move to table the point of order and ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
So
Barrasso.
they're
Bennett.
tabling the
Mrs.
point of
Blackburn.
order, which is,
Mr. Blumenthal.
I don't know, the table? Is he trying to
Booker.
table the tabling?
Mr.
Is that where
Bozeman.
we're at?
Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt.
I
Mr.
think
Brown.
that's where we're at.
Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito.
Yeah,
Cardin.
so of,
Mr. Carper.
let's see,
Mr. Casey.
there's willful
Cassidy.
and systemic failure
Ms. Collins.
to obey or follow.
Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr.
And
Crapo.
2 is
Cruz. Mr. Daines.
breach of
Ms.
the
Duckworth.
public
Mr. Durbin.
trust.
Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman.
Oh man, thank you
Mrs. Fisher.
so much.
Mr.
That's my
Gillibrand.
first
Mr. Graham.
ever.
Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan.
That's
Hawley.
amazing.
Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr.
Thank you,
Rono.
Jorge.
Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr.
Like
Johnson.
that.
Mr. Kane.
2. Hey,
Mr. Kelly.
and love.
Mr. Kennedy.
Of course.
Mr. King.
Nice.
Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr.
And so
Markey.
it was obey or follow up. It's
Marshall.
one of those two. It's
Mr.
not
McConnell.
both.
Mr. Menendez.
It's not worded like that.
Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen.
So right now, the Mitch McConnell has
Mr. Round.
put forward a vote
Mr. Rubio.
to table.
Sanders.
What I think
Schatz.
is the effort
Mr.
to
Schmidt.
table.
Mr. Schumer.
It's a move, and right now it's buffering. I'm guessing it's buffering because there's a lot of people actually watching. We are caught up too. That's actually
Mr.
what it
Scott of
was.
Florida.
We were on a minute delay to hear what
Mr. Scott of
Mitch
South
actually
Carolina.
put to a vote.
Mr. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms.
The
Kavanaugh.
votes are kind of uneventful.
Sullivan.
I do tend to lose
Kester.
some viewers. I don't know. I don't know why it's buffering so much. That could be part of it. But I don't mind because I'm so grateful.
Thune.
Jorge, thank you. That was so cool. I've never, that was a first.
Tillis.
First in my
Tuberville.
YouTube career.
Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch.
Can't he say I used the prefix for Mr. for the following? I missed it. I don't know.
Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden.
And Hart,
Mr.
thank
Young.
you for coming back. I streamed earlier today. They kind of set the scene in the morning for what we could expect this afternoon, and Hart was there. So what do you mean, Hart? I don't know. And what? Usually a little bit of a refresh goes a long way. And we're back. Oh. What letter are we on? It looked like Thune just gave a thumbs up. What the heck notification was that? I know you guys heard it. It's like I don't know. So we are live on the Senate floor right now, and this is a lot of people, a lot of butts in the seats. A lot of butts. It's very exciting, very exciting. Look at the little interns and pages and whatever they are. Does anybody know who those people are? They are in blazers, and women are not wearing ties. Men are just kind of sitting there on the sidelines, like the kids on the sidelines at maybe like a football game or something. Mr. Name. Oh yeah. Oh, good. All right. Yeah. Fair enough. That would be efficient, and that's one thing they're not. It's fine. It's my shooting from the hip answer. Yeah, the votes. The votes and the quorum calls. It's hard to keep people interested. I don't know. I gotta figure out something to do.
The yeas are 49. The nays are 51. The motion to table is not agreed to. The motion before the Senate is the point of order. The question is on whether the point of order is well taken. Is there a sufficient second? There is. Clerk will call the roll.
Point of order.
Ms. Baldwin.
I'll show you a point of order.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn.
Or the, was it Scent of a Woman speech? Out of order.
Mr. Blumenthal.
I'll show you out of order.
Mr. Booker.
I'm too old, too tired,
Mr.
too effing
Bozeman.
blind.
Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy.
So this is the
Ms. Collins.
the vote on the point of order.
Mr. Coons.
I think this is the point of order
Mr.
being
Cornyn.
Senator Schumer saying that
Ms.
they
Cortez
want to
Masto.
table this. Is my understanding.
Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin.
The way Hawley
Ms.
talks,
Ernst.
you'd think he'd be in there with like a flamethrower, like, how
Mr. Fetterman.
dare you?
Mrs. Fisher. Mrs.
Josh Hawley.
Gillibrand.
It's my muse.
Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty.
Yeah.
Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper.
I was watching Cotton
Ms.
this
Hirono.
morning in committee. He's
Mr.
good.
Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
Who got there first, Hawley or Cotton?
Mr. Johnson.
Or was it? I feel like they get
Mr.
conflated.
Kane.
They're kind of like
Mr. Kelly.
wiry guys.
Mr. Kennedy.
I like them.
Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr.
I
Langford.
know what I can do to bring the.
Mr. Lee.
Let's
Mr. Lujan.
get the music back, the energy back, and the.
Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey.
Now. Yes.
Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell.
Working on it.
Mr.
See
Menendez.
what we can do here. Drop a little bit of a like.
Mr.
See if we get
Merkley.
people back in this place.
Mr. Moran.
We're voting,
Mr. Mullen.
I believe.
Ms. Murkowski.
This is the vote to table.
Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff.
Impeachment trial proceedings.
Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters.
Or
Mr.
it's
Reed.
setting up
Mr. Ricketts.
that vote.
Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney.
All right. Better. I'm feeling
Ms.
it.
Rosen.
I'm feeling. All right.
Mr. Rounds.
I have a feeling this is not gonna.
Mr. Rubio.
Because
Mr. Sanders.
here's what happens: they'll have a vote, and then
Mr.
that'll
Schatz.
be it. That'll be it.
Mr. Schmidt.
All right. Adjourned. Gavel out. And it's like, what just happened? What was that vote?
Mr.
even?
Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida.
That happens.
Mr. Scott of South
Sometimes there's
Carolina.
a lot of amendments to keep track of.
Mrs. Shaheen.
Sometimes the
Miss Sinema. Miss Smith.
the names don't always make it
Stabenow.
easy.
Mr. Sullivan.
Let's see. They're getting out of there.
Mr. Tester.
I'm looking at the body
Mr.
language.
Thune. Mr. Tillis.
Let's see.
Mr. Tuberville.
I don't know. Bob Menendez kind
Mr.
of looks
Van
like,
Hollen.
as long as this keeps going on, no one's thinking
Vance.
about me
Mr. Warner.
and my gold bars.
Mr. Warnock.
Is it that he's not there? I can't hear him.
Ms. Warren.
Who is the dude
Mr. Welch.
right here? Do you see my mouse?
Mr. Whitehouse.
That guy has been out
Mr.
the
Wicker.
entire time.
Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
Front row. Say like the 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock position. Like this. He's kind of bracing his seat. I've seen judges like that too. It's scary when you're, watching a judge and they're kind of nodding in and out, and then you're looking at them and they wake up and they see you looking at them and you're kind of like that. I didn't notice, Judge. I wasn't looking at you. It happens. It happens. It's a very sedentary job, so kind of feel bad for him. Oh, thank you so much, The Heart. Thank you. Can you hear my little one stomping around? Was anybody here last night when she demanded to be on stream? I wasn't stiffing arming her. Like she got on stream. She's very cute, but the goal is to keep the youngest one off the internet as long as we can. She's our Rapunzel baby. So. That's the goal. It didn't happen last night. So. Gosh. It is April, and there are how many more months until November? This channel would like to see a changed administration, to say the least. And a few of these guys, I'm not sure how many senators are up for re-election this year, how many House seats are up. We can find that out together. How many Senate seats and House seats up this year for re-election? 33 seats for re-election in the Senate, and all 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up for re-election. Wow, every passing 2 years is really a chance to clean house. Do you think that's where that came from? Probably not, but could be. I like how they at least give themselves a time limit. It's just on the edge. It's at 7:23. Is what I imagine is the most. There's some sort of tallying going on right now. I think it's the gentleman in the glasses next to the. I think where do you? Yes. Next to the lady in the pink at the table, the tally table there, whatever they call that, the fancy table you got all the interns huddled around. But I think we all kind of know, don't we? You came back. It's okay, Jorge, you can stay. I get it if you don't want to. This is a very stop and go. Less stop and go than court can be sometimes, but very stop and go. Not as salacious as like a committee meeting where there's a lot of back and forth. Yeah, that's my jam. Floor live streams. I mean, at least there's a lot of people. I mean, it's hard to tell because they're not letting anything, Cruz and
On this
Kennedy
vote, the
tried
yeas are
to
51,
get a
the
trial,
nays
and
are
they're not letting
48.
us hear any more
One
evidence
senator responded present.
in the Senate.
The point of order
based
is
on the
well
House.
taken, and the article falls.
Madam President,
Majority Leader is recognized.
I raise a point of order that Impeachment Article 2 does not allege conduct that rises to the level of a high crime or misdemeanor as required under Article 2, Section 4 of the United States Constitution and is therefore unconstitutional.
Madam President.
Under the precedents and practices of the Senate, the chair has no power or authority to pass on such a point of order. The chair, therefore, under the precedents of the Senate, submits the question to the Senate. Is the point of order well taken? Senator from Utah is recognized.
Madam President, as wrong as the majority leader was moments ago in making this particular point of order as to Article 1 of the impeachment articles. Article 1, remember, refers to the willful defiance by Secretary Mayorkas of the law. As wrong as he was in making that as to Article 1, and he was very wrong for the reasons articulated moments ago by the senator from Texas, he is even more wrong, far more so, with respect to Article 2, because Article 2 accuses him of knowingly making false statements. This is a violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, a felony offense. If this is not a high crime and misdemeanor, what is? If this is not impeachable, what is? What precedent will be setting? We need to address this, and to discuss it, we need to discuss it in closed session. For that reason, Madam President, I move that the Senate proceed to closed session to allow for deliberation on this very consequential point of order that he's just made. That violates hundreds of years of Anglo-American legal precedent and understanding on the question required by Impeachment Rule 24.
Question is
a nays.
The question is on the motion. Is there sufficient second? There is. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett.
There's precedent.
Mrs. Blackburn.
I think there should be a trial. Let me say that. The allegations
Blumenthal.
are,
Mr. Booker.
like I said, I
Mr.
believe,
Bozeman.
willful
Braun.
and systemic, failure to follow the law.
Mr. Brown.
If they're
Mr.
not
Budd.
vetting
Ms.
people
Butler.
that they should
Ms.
be,
Cantwell. Mrs. Capito.
and then breach the public trust. So the House
Mr. Cardin.
voted on this,
Mr.
And
Carper.
so, to me, if the House
Mr.
is the House
Casey.
of the people, the representative of the
Mr.
people,
Cassidy.
the population, it's supposed to be more so than the Senate.
Ms.
So
Collins.
if the House is saying there's a
Mr.
breach of the
Coons.
public trust, then that tells me that, there's something at least to be looked at there. And so, the Senate, in my opinion, the House
Mr.
is supposed to be
Cornyn.
like the grand jury,
Ms. Cortez
and the House
Masto.
is supposed to be more like the trial.
Mr. Cotton.
And
Mr.
you get a
Kramer.
lot out of the grand jury, but there should be more.
Mr. Crapo.
Should be more coming out of the
Mr.
trial.
Cruz.
And it's in
Mr.
order
Dane.
to really make a decision on something, on a
Duckworth.
trial, on charges, you
Mr.
really have to
Durbin.
watch the whole trial.
Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman.
In my opinion, there have been impeachments before,
Mrs.
and they've
Fisher.
either resigned or been
Mrs.
impeached.
Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley.
If the House
Mr. Haggerty.
went to the lengths that
Ms.
they
Hassan.
did, there's something to
Mr.
look
Hawley.
at.
Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper.
But this is politics.
Mr. Rono.
Yesterday, Kennedy had the great quote was,
Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
if you have the votes,
Mr.
you can
Johnson.
force a koala to
Mr.
eat
Kane.
hot peppers and like
Mr.
it.
Kelly. Mr. Kennedy.
He said a few good things yesterday. What did he say?
Mr. King.
He's not happy. His arms
Mr.
are crossed
Klobuchar.
over there. You see him?
Mr. Langford.
He's in the top left corner.
Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan.
He's really offended by this whole thing.
Ms. Lummis.
His body language in the
Manchin.
hearings with Mayorkas.
Mr.
Yeah, every
Markey.
5 minutes they do a roll call
Mr.
to wake him
Marshall.
up, Hart. That's funny.
Mr. McConnell.
You're probably right.
Mr. Menendez.
At least the one guy
Mr.
in the front
Merkley.
row is actually upright. I don't know if you noticed. He was
Mr.
just
Moran.
like,
Mr. Mullen.
who is that? Who's the oldest senator? Let's find it, because that's who that's
Ms.
gotta be.
Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul.
And that is
Mr. Peters.
Grassley.
Mr. Reed.
And I kind of knew that.
Mr. Ricketts.
He's down again. You
Mr.
see-
Risch. Mr. Romney.
Shout out to you laughing. Do you
Rosen.
see it? Do you see him down and out? Oh no, I think
Mr. Rounds.
yeah, he's down again.
Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt.
So yeah,
Mr.
the
Schumer.
allegations of Alejandro
Scott of
Mayorkas,
Florida.
Secretary of
Scott of South Carolina.
Department of Homeland Security,
Mrs. Shaheen.
oversees border immigration.
Ms. Sinema. Ms.
It
Smith.
seems like something is
Ms.
afoot.
Stabenow.
Something
Mr.
is
Sullivan.
afoot.
Mr. Tester. Mr.
And I don't
Thune,
necessarily think it's coming from
Mr. Tillis.
Mayorkas.
Mr. Tuberville.
He's just the
Mr.
secretary.
Van Hollen. Mr. Vance.
But there is a bigger plot,
Mr.
right?
Warner. Mr. Warnock.
Did anyone hear
Ms. Warren.
you yet?
Welch.
Dude, we didn't get another hear ye. Yeah, there was
White
the
House.
sergeant of arms doing a hear ye. Jeez, welcome back.
Mr. Wicker.
All right.
Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
I will say that, and it's probably obvious, my needle is in favor of an impeachment trial and removal. But the trial is for, debate and evidence, and I could be moved. It's, Mayorkas is not an idiot. He's a smart guy. There might be, I don't know. There can't be a good reason. The best reasons I've heard is not great. We're gonna need to replace the workforce, and the tax base is gonna be huge, and no one wants to talk about the votes. But it comes up in committee hearings. Who pointed it out? I think it was Kennedy that said, "Isn't this gonna create more electoral votes?" And then Mayorkas's line was, "I don't think I understand the question," to that. So. I mean, if he is, so the question also becomes, are these guys lying in committee hearings? Is the director of the FBI, when he says, "not to my knowledge," or when Mayorkas says, "I don't understand the question," is that true? Or is that the line? Because those are, if it were you or me lying to Congress, that's a big deal. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about the whole thing. I know how they feel. They feel they're very self-important.
On this vote, the nays are 49, the yeas are 49, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. The pending
So
business
that
is
was
the
a vote
point
to
of order
go back
raised by
to
the
closed
majority
session.
leader.
That was Mike
Madam
Lee.
President,
Senator from
His
Florida.
vote.
Madam President, as jurors, we have not had the time to review whether this point of order is contrary to the Constitution. Therefore, I
Senator
move to
Scott.
adjourn the Court of Impeachment until 12 p.m. noon on Tuesday, April 30th, and ask for the yeas and nays.
That was the
Is there a
same
sufficient
vote
second?
as Kennedy.
There is a sufficient second. The
Adjourn
clerk will call the
until
roll.
April
Ms.
20th
Baldwin.
or 30th. Why can't I remember
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr.
It's
Bozeman.
an admirable effort. I suppose.
Mr. Braun. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown.
Like maybe someone comes to their senses, like, yeah, we should
Mr.
adjourn
Budd.
until April 30th or 28th.
Ms. Butler. Ms. Cantwell.
But like I
Mrs.
said, I think
Capito.
this vote, this exact same
Mr.
vote,
Cardin.
we just had this vote
Mr.
30 minutes
Carper.
ago, maybe,
Mr. Casey.
and it didn't work.
Mr. Cassidy.
Hart, I don't know if you're retracting
Ms.
your messages
Collins.
or I have some sort of blacklist for a
Coons.
word. I don't. I didn't set up anything.
Mr.
so
Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto.
what are you trying to say?
Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer.
This is like a last ditch
Crapo.
effort is what I think to
Mr. Cruz.
adjourn, because
Mr.
adjourning
James.
at least
Ms.
the
Duckworth.
impeachment is still possible. But
Mr.
if they
Durbin.
do what Schumer is suggesting, they
Ms.
actually
Ernst.
are tabling it, I think, more or less
Mr.
permanently.
Fetterman.
Oh yeah. Oh, he's up now. That's Chuck Grassley from
Mrs.
Iowa.
Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand.
I had to look it up. I had a hunch that it was Chuck Grassley
Graham.
from Iowa, but this is almost it.
Grassley.
I don't know if there's going to be any more interruptions. They're not interruptions. They're
Mr. Haggerty.
Grassley hanging in there.
Ms.
They're
Hassan.
they're an effort to
Hawley.
actually get something done or
Mr. Heinrich.
to prevent something from being
Mr.
done.
Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono.
And at least the music is climactic,
Hoban.
right, chat?
Mrs. Hyde Smith. Mr. Johnson.
So funny story.
Mr. Kane.
During the quorum call before
Kelly.
Hart and everybody else who was here,
Mr. Kennedy.
I was able to get my kids to the playground with their babysitter.
Mr. King.
That's how long that quorum
Ms.
call took.
Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee.
But they're home now.
Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall.
Wait, what is Hart?
Mr.
What did I miss?
McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed.
All right. R S
Mr.
T
Ricketts.
U V.
Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney.
Barely
Ms.
down.
Rosen.
I think Mr.
Rounds.
Young is when we know we're
Mr.
at
Rubio.
the end.
Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz.
You know, what's so funny. Some
Mr.
election
Schmidt.
cycles you hear a lot
Mr.
from
Schumer.
somebody, and then you never
Mr.
hear
Scott
from
of
them
Florida.
again.
Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen.
A file was put together.
Miss Sinema. Miss Smith. Miss Stabenow.
A file.
Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis.
I think
Mr.
we're gonna get a
Tuberville.
49-51.
Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
Okay. Warnock's another good signal that we're getting towards the end of the roll call. How, Daniel? How? I guess it's really an election thing. You got to get the right people in. I don't know. Maybe that's not even it. It's time. Your high school file is thick. Art. I was a pretty good kid in high school. The thin file. So they're tallying right now. Sorry, I'm like completely zoned out, and I don't blame anybody. Kind of listening to music and just like looking into the void that is the Senate chamber, the void of humanity. Just kidding. Oh boy. And so yeah, they're tallying the vote. This is, I think, the last effort to stop the tabling of the impeachment trial. And she just handed it to the President of the Senate.
The yeas are 49, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to.
Madam President, a parliamentary inquiry.
Senator will state his parliamentary inquiry.
I appreciate that my friend from New York is eager to get this done with. But are we about to set a precedent that the allegation of a felony is not a high crime and misdemeanor?
That is not an appropriate parliamentary inquiry.
Madam President, I understand there are other ways for the majority to move this off the floor of the Senate, but I would urge my
colleagues the senator have a motion
to understand
to make?
what we're doing.
The question is on the point of order raised by the majority leader.
Madam President.
The senator from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam President. I have a motion, and it takes precedence. As I appreciate the majority leader's allegation,
Yes.
lying to the United States Congress is not a high crime and misdemeanor. You don't have to be Mensa material to know that it's not only a high crime and misdemeanor, it is a felony.
Would the senator please state his motion?
I will. Since we're not allowed to talk among ourselves about the absurdity of this, and my Democratic colleagues will not allow us to go into closed session to talk about the absurdity of this,
the Senate is
I
not
move
in a
that we adjourn until 12 o'clock noon on May the 1st, 2004, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? Would the senator modify his motion? I would ask the senator to modify his motion.
Madam President, 2004 would probably be preferable. But I'll accept a friendly amendment. We make it 2024.
The question is on the motion. Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Oh my God.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso.
I see what they're doing now.
Mr. Bennett.
You know?
Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal.
How futile is it, though?
Mr. Booker.
Respectable, yes, I suppose. It takes about
Mr.
5,
Bozeman.
6, 7 minutes,
Mr. Braun.
depending.
Mrs. Britt. Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd.
Yep.
Ms. Butler.
This is where we're at.
Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey.
It's not quite a filibuster. What do you call
Cassidy.
it? Anybody know?
Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn.
Why not?
Ms. Cortez Masto.
It's hilarious.
Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher.
Mr. Fetterman.
Mrs. Gilliram.
You know.
Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley.
It really
Mr.
is
Haggerty.
something how they get all the Democrats
Ms.
to vote
Hassan.
lockstep all the time.
Mr.
It
Hawley.
seems like
Mr. Heinrich. Mr.
they
Hickenlooper.
all got files on each other. Just get it.
Mr. Rono. Mr. Hoven.
Hoven. Young H-O-V.
Mrs. Hyde Smith. Mr.
Grassley's
Johnson.
up. He's
Mr.
moving.
Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar.
I don't know if you can see it. Mitch
Mr.
McConnell looks like
Lankford.
he's got a
Mr. Lee.
big old smile on his face.
Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis.
Whose strategy do you think this was? I'm going to guess Ted Cruz, maybe?
Mr. Manchin.
He clerked for the Supreme Court.
Mr.
He probably
Markey.
knows a lot of rules and procedures
Marshall.
and loopholes
Mr.
and
McConnell.
stuff
Menendez.
like that.
Mr. Merkley.
My guess.
Mr. Moran.
Don't think it
Mr.
came
Mullen.
from McConnell.
Ms.
Could be a
Murkowski.
staffer.
Mr. Murphy.
Where'd the M's?
Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch.
I think this might go on for a while.
Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen.
Could be.
Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan.
Do you think the people who
Mr.
usually
Tester.
count, they're like, our job's
Thune.
easy today.
Mr. Tillis.
It's going to be 49
Mr.
51 all day long.
Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
I can't believe they're not having a trial. It is something. It is something. All right. They're pretending to count. Yeah, you. All right, you. It's like, okay. I don't like the way Schumer just kind of slinks there in his seat. I don't like it. Who's doing what? They all got plans for tonight. They all got like little fundraising cocktail parties to go to. Grassley, there, he's making his way back to his seat. Oh, he made it over the step. He's back. And he's in. Ah! That's the excitement we're getting. Chuck Grassley getting into his seat without incident. We have a lot of papers being shuffled and people pretending to count votes. Just kidding. He's looking to the right, looking up, saying probably something like 4951. Try to make this as interesting as possible. Announcing, it's like announcing, more like closer to announcing golf than cage fighting. Come on, turn around and hand that skinny long piece of paper. All right, we have interns or pages removing podiums from the desks. Schumer still has one. McConnell still has one. I don't know that Kennedy had one. It's not 100% indicative of who's going to speak and who's not, but it's usually a pretty good indicator. I just feel, like Jim Jordan should bust in there in his wrestling, unitard, onesie. Make it into a WWE thing, an event. And I'm a Jim Jordan fan. Let me just say that. But wrestling guys are built different. They're wired different, and he is in a good way. What do you think? If we give them the vote too fast, then they're gonna know we didn't really count it. We gotta just. What I think was somebody out of the room during the vote. I don't know, is that Mike Lee up there? I think what it looked like was he was out of the room and he might not have been counted. He's just trying to get his vote count. I don't know. I have no idea. I can just make it up as I go too. How you doing, chat? An admirable effort. I mean, next to Grassley, McConnell looks spry, to be honest. Okay. Oh, we got a half turn from the counting table there. Ugh. Sorry. It's not even building suspense. It's building an inevitable disappointment. Just look at some of the pages and know that they're up to no good in committee rooms after hours. What are you doing? I would really like to see this come to a conclusion, but I understand that they feel like they need to keep moving to adjourn until, was it April, and now we're in May. And what do you think? The next motion to adjourn for May 2nd or June or some other date that's really cool that I'm not thinking about?
On this vote, the yeas are 49, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. The pending motion is the point of order preferred by the Senate Majority
Are we gonna
Leader.
get another one?
Madam President.
Senator from Kansas is recognized.
Madam President, I have a motion and it takes precedent. Before this body disrespects the Constitution any further, before we endanger our republic anymore, before we harm the reputation of this body anymore, I move to adjourn until 7
slurring his
a.m.
words?
on November 6th, 2024,
November
so the American
6th.
people can at least have a vote on this impeachment trial.
Hey, all right.
Question is on the motion.
Clap
Is
for
there a
that one.
sufficient second?
That date makes sense to me, assuming that we're talking
Is there a
about election,
sufficient
or
second?
maybe the day
There is
after
a sufficient
election.
second. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso.
Not gonna lie, Kennedy looked like he
Mr.
wasn't
Bennett.
sure he was saying the date that he picked.
Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker.
So the last vote took 10 minutes.
Mr. Bozeman.
Right now, what we're having is like a,
Mr. Braun.
I don't know what this strategy is called. It's
Mrs.
not,
Britt.
does it quite fit a
Mr.
filibuster?
Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms.
Let's try
Butler.
to find out.
Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy.
Okay.
Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons.
Yeah, it's not technically a filibuster, but it serves
Mr.
a similar
Cornyn.
purpose.
Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz.
It's just a tactic or maneuver.
Mr. Daines.
A dilatory.
Ms. Duckworth.
But it should have a name.
Mr.
It should
Durbin.
have a fun name.
Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley.
What's the
Mr. Haggerty.
What's a fun name for this? This isn't. We can name this.
Ms. Hassan.
Why? Because I say so. Look, this isn't
Mr.
quite
Hawley.
a filibuster, but this is a maneuver or a
Mr.
tactic,
Heinrich.
just similar. But keep moving to adjourn. Keep moving to adjourn as
Mr.
a way
Hickenlooper.
of just kind of biding time. I don't know
Ms.
exactly.
Hirono. Mr. Hoven.
Yeah.
Mrs.
Cruising.
Hyde
We can call
Smith.
it cruising. I think he might have
Mr.
set
Johnson.
this chain in motion.
Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy.
Cruise.
Mr. King.
Yes.
Ms. Klobuchar.
Should we just keep a cruise?
Langford.
Yeah.
Mr. Lee.
Let me get into the chat.
Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lemus. Mr. Manchin. Mr.
Keep
Markey.
trying to adjourn.
Marshall. Mr. McConnell.
Isn't quite.
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran.
Should we call it a cruise?
Mr. Mullen.
I don't know.
Ms. Murkowski.
It seemed like a good idea.
Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed.
Cruise control.
Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds.
I can't
Mr.
believe
Rubio. Mr.
there's
Sanders.
not more people in here for this cleverness.
Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida.
Oh, those
Scott of
notifications
South
are
Carolina.
Discord. I was wondering what
Mrs. Shaheen.
black magic is
Ms.
this?
Cinema. Ms. Smith.
I
Ms.
better
Stabenow.
just close Discord.
Mr. Sullivan.
Come on.
Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune.
I think they
Mr. Tillis.
they can be doing this. This
Mr.
could be
Tuberville.
they could be at this for a
Mr.
while.
Van Hollen.
That's my
Mr. Vance.
see. That's my feeling.
Warner.
So
Mr. Warnock. Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch.
Thank you, Mr. Diggers.
Mr. Whitehouse.
Jeffrey.
Mr. Wicker.
You know, I don't have a strong opinion on any of the world religions.
Mr. Young.
My problem is I have a curiosity that goes back to before that. You know? And none of them address it. They all try to address it. They all address it similarly, and it's kind of odd. You know, there's a great flood myth. And then what's before that? And you know, what is it? The book of Enoch. I find that interesting.
On this vote, the yeas are 49, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed. The pending motion is the point of order raised by the Majority Leader.
Madam President.
Senator from Alaska.
Madam President, we seem to be in unprecedented territory here, so I have a parliamentary inquiry.
State your inquiry, please.
Madam President, has there been a successfully invoked point of order to dispose of an article of impeachment prior to opening arguments by the House managers?
The chair is not aware of any such occurrence.
Thank you, Madam President. Unprecedented territory, as I mentioned.
Pending business is the point of order raised by the Majority Leader. The yeas and nays.
Madam President.
They're really getting to him.
Point of parliamentary inquiry.
Madam President.
The senator from Louisiana is seeking recognition. Will you state why you've asked for recognition?
Like Senator
I'm sorry, I
Kennedy.
couldn't hear you, Madam President.
Senator from Louisiana is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. I have a motion, and it takes precedent.
State your motion, please.
Before we establish a precedent that lying to the United States Congress is not a felony,
The senator from Louisiana will state his motion.
and before we add a new chapter to the movie Pulp Fiction,
Please, would the
I
senator,
move that we go into executive session to at least allow us to talk about the breathtaking precedent we're about to establish here. And I ask for the yeas and nays.
The question is on the motion to proceed to executive session. The yeas and nays have been requested. Is there a sufficient second?
Do you see that she's just being fed
There
lines
is a
by her
sufficient
staffer?
second. The clerk will call the roll.
There's
Ms.
not
Baldwin.
even like an ear.
Mr. Barrasso.
It's just
From 1900?
Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker.
So now we have a
Mr.
vote to
Bozeman.
go into executive session.
Braun.
They're no longer trying to adjourn, although they could
Mrs. Britt.
continue to try to adjourn after
Mr. Brown.
this.
Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo.
What do you think,
Mr.
Chad?
Cruz. Mr. Daines.
A
Ms.
valiant
Duckworth.
effort or a futile one?
Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr.
I think
Graham.
they can flip.
Mr. Grassley.
I think they can flip Fetterman with enough time.
Mr. Haggerty.
But even still,
Ms.
they'll need another
Hassan.
vote.
Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich.
Who could they flip?
Mr. Hickenlooper.
Who is like disenfranchised among the Democrats? Seems like they're not happy.
Ms. Rono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith.
It was a big deal that Nebraska state senator changed teams, and that was kind of a big deal.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly,
Do you think like Goldman is
Mr.
just
Kennedy.
abused? You know, they're terrible to him. He looks like he's
Mr. King,
their whipping boy.
Ms.
Goldman.
Klobuchar,
Like Goldman, you're the one that has to say something. And they just make him
Mr. Langford,
do all the lying.
Mr. Lee,
Or maybe he's really good at it and he's just like eager to lie. I don't know.
Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall,
Can't quite
Mr.
see.
McConnell.
But Grassley is writing something in his little
Mr.
drawer there.
Menendez,
I wonder what it is.
Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran,
Taking notes. He's gonna say something. Do you think he's gonna
Mr.
get up
Mullen.
and say something?
Mr. Murkowski,
Just getting up at that age is powerful
Mr. Murphy,
in and of itself.
Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla,
Here we go.
Mr. Paul,
Warnock and Young.
Mr. Peters,
Where we're
Mr.
wrapped
Reed,
up. Come on.
Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schmidt,
49-51.
Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina,
Kennedy wagging
Mrs.
his finger at
Shaheen.
the intern saying something like, don't you ever grow up to do
Ms.
this kind of
Sinema.
thing.
Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow,
Knocking
Mr.
it,
Sullivan.
patting his hand on
Mr.
the
Chester.
that table,
Mr. Thune, Mr.
tallying
Tillis,
table. I wonder what they call that table. Is there a name?
Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Vance,
Let's find out.
Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren,
It's called the rostrum.
Mr. Welch.
That's the rostrum is where the
Mr.
Senate
White House.
president is sitting.
Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
Does that table have a name? Like rostrum. It's such a official, esoteric name. And so that's just the clerk's table or the clerk's desk where they're tallying votes. Tallying away. Sometimes, this is why we got the music going on, because sometimes it's very anticlimactic, but this music. Gotta love it. Gotta love it. Newer channel, if you haven't already, we hit that subscribe button. If you're looking for the like button, it's hidden behind 3 buttons in the top. If you go all the way up to that corner, there should be 3 dots. You hit that and then the like. And that helps. That helps. Subscribing helps. Or, you know, just pop it in when you want is cool too. That's helpful. Chatting helps. It all helps. It's all great. I'm learning. I'm learning too. And I'm so grateful because I never thought I'd grow, you know, past like the 23 people, my friends and family that watch me. Who, me? Sanic. Sanic is your name for the little bit, the Sonic knockoff. My son's a big fan, so I have all the Sonic. Sonic.exe,
On this vote,
Curse
the
Sonic,
yeas
Sonic,
are 49,
Sanic.
the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed to. The pending amendment is the point of order. Pending motion is the point of order raised by the majority leader.
Madam President.
The senator recognizes the Republican whip.
Madam President, I think it goes without saying that the Mayorkas Biden policies have led to the worst border crisis in American history.
So this
7.6
is
million people apprehended.
Yes and no.
1.8 million.
It seems like
gotaways. Who knows how many
the attempt
unaccounted
here
gotaways.
is to table the impeachment trial.
Position in the Senate.
The one thing we
And
know
the
is that
Republicans are
357
trying
people were on the
to
terrorist
adjourn
watch
so they
list
can't
after Kennedy
table
come into
it.
this country.
But this is the
We have a
official impeachment proceedings in the
responsibility
Senate,
to hear
and this is
these
live.
articles of
The
impeachment.
Senate will be in order.
And therefore, I move to table the Schumer point of order. And I ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a
Adjourning and
sufficient
tabling. All the
second. Clerk will
motions
call the
are
roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
adjourning and tabling.
Mr. Barrasso.
Enter a
Mr.
closed
Bennett.
session, enter an executive session.
Mrs. Blackburn.
It's a strategy. It's a strategy, and there's no name
Mr.
for it.
Blumenthal.
It's kind of like a filibuster, but it's not quite a filibuster.
Booker.
So what we're trying to do is come up with names for it. And so, I think Cruz might have been one of the
Mr.
first
Bozeman.
ones to, initiate this today. There might have been someone in
Braun.
the past, but cruise control or a cruise
Britt.
cruise is what we've come up with so far.
Brown.
You got something else. It doesn't have to be based on anybody in
Mr.
particular.
Budd.
Just be a fun word.
Ms. Butler.
Was filibuster based on somebody?
Ms. Cantwell.
Was there like a Mr. Filibuster
Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin.
based on someone's
Mr.
name?
Carper.
Oh,
Mr.
there
Casey.
was a. Oh,
Mr.
not
Cassidy.
a person's given name. It's a Dutch word.
Ms. Collins.
Gebruiter, freebooter,
Mr. Coons.
or pirate.
Mr.
The
Cornyn.
term was adopted into English as freebooter, and then into French
Ms. Cortez
as
Masto.
filibustier, in Spanish
Cotton.
into filibustero.
Mr. Kramer.
Wow.
Mr. Crapo.
Let's keep going with this, referring to
Cruz.
pirates who looted the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean.
Mr. Daines.
In the 19th century, the term
Duckworth.
filibustero was used in the United States to
Mr.
describe
Durbin.
American adventurers who engaged in unauthorized military expeditions into Latin and South America,
Ms.
trying
Ernst.
to incite revolutions and establish new territories independent of
Fetterman.
existing governments. Sounds like a good idea. No, I'm just kidding.
Mrs. Fisher.
Just kidding. These adventurers
Mrs.
were
Gillibrand.
referred to as filibusters. I don't think I knew any of this.
Mr. Graham.
The political usage
Mr.
of
Grassley.
filibuster began in the mid-19th century when opponents of such
Haggerty.
military expeditions in the U.S. Congress started
Hassan.
using extended speeches to block
Mr.
legislation. Over time, this
Mr.
tactic
Heinrich.
itself became known as filibustering,
Mr.
so not based
Hickenlooper.
on someone's name. There wasn't a Mr. Filibuster.
Ms. Hirono.
The term shifted from describing a type of
Mr.
adventurer
Hoven.
to describing a legislative
Mrs. Hyde
tactic
Smith.
aimed at delaying or blocking
Johnson.
the passage of legislation through long
Mr.
speeches
Kane.
or other procedural delays.
Kelly.
So technically, this is
Mr.
a
Kennedy.
procedural. I don't know. Yeah, it's a procedural delay.
Mr. King.
So yes.
Ms. Klobuchar.
So yes and
Langford.
no.
Mr. Lee.
It's the official
Lujan.
attempt to
Ms. Lummis.
sweep
Manchin.
it
Mr.
under
Markey.
the rug,
Mr. Marshall.
and it's
Mr.
the
McConnell.
official
Mr. Menendez.
attempt.
Mr. Merkley.
I don't know if it's blocked
Mr. Moran. Mr. Mullen.
to circumvent
Ms. Murkowski.
that from happening. Is really what it is.
Mr.
It's supposed to
Murphy.
be the impeachment trial, right? But
Mrs.
instead,
Murray.
it's not that. You know,
Mr.
it's,
Ossoff.
it's like they're right there. It's just about to bring it to
Mr.
trial, but it's
Padilla.
not quite brought.
Mr. Paul.
So this is, it's almost like a
Mr.
filibuster. It's
Peters.
not necessarily a long speech, but if each senator gets up and says, I want to
Mr.
adjourn,
Reed.
motion to adjourn until so-and-so
Mr.
date.
Ricketts.
Motion to enter a closed session,
Mr. Risch.
executive session.
Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen.
And so this is the motion to table
Mr.
the
Rounds.
constitutional point of order.
Mr.
as you can see.
Rubio.
You can see that.
Mr. Sanders.
And I believe, a lot
Schatz.
of what we're hearing is senators
Schmidt.
standing up and saying,
Mr. Schumer.
that Mayorkas lied
Mr.
under
Scott of
oath,
Florida.
and that is a felony. But
Scott
that's
of South
not
Carolina.
exactly what I don't think that
Mrs.
is
Shaheen.
the charges that were brought. The charges,
Ms. Sinema.
according to Kennedy, were
Ms. Smith. Ms.
were
Stabenow.
systemic, willful and systemic failure to obey the law,
Mr. Sullivan.
and
Tester.
breach of public trust. But I think that's probably
Mr. Thune.
the lying to
Mr. Tillis.
lying under oath is probably an element of
Mr.
one of
Tuberville.
those things.
Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr.
So,
Warner.
Here we go. Warner, Warnock, and Young.
Mr. Warnock.
Yes.
Ms. Warren.
Oh, Warren.
Mr. Welch.
Welch. Wow. Okay.
Mr. Whitehouse.
That was way off.
Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
There we go. There we are. Ooh, there's some guy just hobbling around. You see him? He almost looked like he was going to make it. At least Schumer's sitting up straight now. He's not slinked over in his chair like he usually is. I don't know, who does he think he is? Thomas Jefferson? Right. Todd. So, yes, I think in no circumstance do they have the votes to bring this to trial or to impeach him, or it's basically become a political thing. It's not a judicial thing, right, where there's evidence, the preponderance of the evidence, or, the other standards are beyond a reasonable doubt, right? This is just political. So people don't need to listen to evidence. They can just vote along party lines, which is what they're doing. It's a political process, not a legal one. There's been,
On this vote, the yeas are 49, the nays are 51. The motion is not agreed
Stinks,
to.
yeah.
The
Room full of
pending
stinks.
business is the point of order
5,000,
offered
according
by
to
the
who was
Senate
that?
Majority Leader.
Madam
Muhammad
President,
Ali.
parliamentary inquiry.
Senator will state his inquiry.
Madam President, I inquire whether the actions we take today are creating a precedent on impeachments that would apply to all future impeachment actions in the Senate, including an impeachment of the President of the United States.
She doesn't know. So she's just going to be. You see
would
this?
apply in future impeachment hearings.
The lady with the glasses is right there telling her what to do. Not her.
The question is on the point of
It's
order.
almost like it's a puppet show. It's a literal puppet
Is there a
show.
sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal.
I think it's filibustering.
Mr. Booker.
Now,
Mr.
if
Bozeman.
you use the old school definition of
Mr.
getting up
Braun.
and making a long speech, and just everybody getting
Mrs.
up
Britt.
and making long speeches, it's not technically
Brown.
a filibuster. It's everybody
Mr.
getting up and making
Budd.
short speeches, short motions to
Ms. Butler.
adjourn, go into closed session, go into
Cantwell.
executive session.
Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin.
Yeah.
Mr.
So-
Carper. Mr. Casey.
This was not how I thought it was going to
Mr.
go.
Cassidy. Ms.
Interesting
Collins.
to watch Chuck Grassley
Mr.
hang in
Coons.
there. Listen, this
Mr.
could be the
Cornyn.
last time we ever see Senator Grassley. It's not a threat. Listen,
Ms.
these aren't
Cortez
threats. This is
Masto.
an old guy who's barely
Mr.
hanging in
Cotton.
there. He's like this
Mr.
half
Kramer.
the time.
Mr. Crapo.
Asleep at the wheel.
Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines.
I hope all these people
Ms. Duckworth.
live a long time and die of old age.
Mr. Durbin.
But some of them are old and should go.
Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham.
I don't know. What do you think, chat? Filibustering adjacent. Yeah.
Mr. Grassley.
That's funny. Mr. Grassley.
Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper.
So is Hawley just said all he has to say in committee? Because he has
Mr.
said
Rono.
a lot. He has torn into my
Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar.
So the question is,
Mr.
if he gets up,
Langford.
which it sort of
Lee.
seems like everybody is going to get up and
Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis.
filibuster
Mr. Manchin.
adjacent. That's funny. That's a heart.
Mr. Markey.
At least you tried the experiment, Jesus. I was hoping for more people to try to name this thing.
Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell.
You know?
Mr. Menendez.
And every time they go to a vote, my stream,
Mr. Markley.
you can kind of see it. It's like the heartbeat monitor.
Mr. Moran.
You know, it's like who wants to stick around for this?
Mr. Mullen.
You're
Mr.
a trooper
Murkowski.
if you're sticking around for it.
Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray.
I'm here to see if
Mr.
Grassley
Ossoff. Mr. Padilla.
hangs in
Mr.
there.
Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr.
Also,
Reed.
you know who we haven't heard from?
Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Rich.
Senator Lindsey Graham.
Mr. Romney.
I used to be a big Graham
Rosen.
fan, like in a sarcastic
Mr.
way.
Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr.
It's another
Schmidt.
one. It's like, who keeps reelecting these
Mr.
people?
Schumer.
It's beloved, I guess. I don't know. From where is he from? South Carolina.
Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith.
And so this is the
Ms.
vote.
Stabenow.
This could be the vote on the.
Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester.
With
Mr. Thune.
Schumer's
Mr. Tillis. Mr.
point of order,
Tuberville.
which I think is to table.
Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance.
Big
Mr.
pressure.
Warner.
Yeah.
Mr. Warnock.
Unfortunately,
Mr. Welch.
it's such a puppet
Mr.
show.
White House. Mr. Wicker.
Oh,
Mr. Wyden.
sit back and watch the wheels come off.
Mr.
You
Young.
know? Constitutional point of order. They're counting at the clerk's table. And then the rostrum is what we learned. That's where the president of the Senate sits. Now, the president of the Senate could be the vice president of the United States or whoever they shuffle in there. Let's be real. Is it like ceremonial? Because the president of the Senate is the vice president. Okay. Who's counting? Can we tell? Glasses. Glasses clerk. Looks like he's finished. He's chit-chatting. Maybe he's still counting. Was that too quick? Should I do it again? It's kind of like scoring a fight. Only not at all. Only nothing like that. At least the music is pleasant. Okay. And are the votes tallied? You can kind of see at the desk when they're just wrapping up. When they turn around and they, hand the long, skinny piece of paper. That's when things are done. There we go. The pass off. And the mic.
On this vote, Senate will be in order. On
You're
this
not
vote,
the only one
yeas
with
are
a
51,
gavel, lady.
The nays are 49. The point of order is well taken. Article 2 falls.
Madam President,
Majority Leaders recognized.
I move to adjourn the impeachment trial of Alejandro N. Mayorkas, sine die, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is a sufficient second. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso.
Latin phrase, without a day.
Mr. Bennett. Did he say aye? Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun.
Probably typing that's
Britt.
going to get me some sort of flag.
Mr. Brown. Mr. Budd. Ms. Butler.
It's Latin. Sorry.
Ms. Cantwell.
Let me be very clear,
Mrs. Capito.
just so I don't get flagged for
Cardin.
typing things that are... Because everything is so offensive.
Mr.
I don't even know
Carper.
what it is, right?
Mr. Casey.
Seen oof.
Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins.
So this is it. This is the most. This is the big one.
Mr. Coons.
Unfortunately, this is it. This is what it all comes down to. It's been a 49-51 divide all day. I don't think it's going to change right
Ms.
now.
Cortez Masto.
The wild card, in my opinion, is Fetterman.
Cotton.
You never know what he's going to
Kramer.
do. He could surprise everybody, but then it would be tied, and
Mr.
then
Crapo.
the president
Mr.
of the Senate
Cruz.
would vote and would break that
Mr.
tie,
Daines.
and that would be,
Ms.
I believe,
Duckworth.
Kamala Harris. I think I could be wrong. There could be
Mr.
some special
Durbin.
procedure for
Ms. Ertz.
this particular kind of circumstance.
Mr.
but
Fetterman.
I think that's it.
Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono.
Disappointing.
Mr. Hoven.
I was really holding out for Fetterman.
Mrs. Hyde Smith.
Yeah, that could be
Mr.
true.
Johnson. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy.
Remember what was that?
Mr. King.
Was it the movie Old School where the guy?
Ms.
I think they're doing
Klobuchar.
some sort of like Jeopardy thing, and then he has like a moment of
Mr.
clarity, and he
Langford.
forgets it like immediately afterwards. Like, what
Mr.
happened?
Lee.
Like that's the feeling you get with
Mr.
Fetterman.
Lujan. Mr. Lummis. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Mr. Menendez.
Oh, can't believe that guy still gets a vote.
Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran.
Like, what does it take to be
Mullen.
considered a traitor? Because I'm
Ms.
sure
Murkowski.
if someone in this
Murphy.
chat, did something like Bob
Mrs.
Menendez,
Murray.
we would be thrown in jail.
Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Paul. Mr. Peters. Mr. Reed. Mr. Ricketts. Mr. Risch. Mr. Romney.
It would be funny
Ms. Rosen.
if Chuck Grassley's last name was Ricketts. I don't know.
Rounds.
He's so advanced in age. Let's
Mr.
say.
Rubio.
Mr. Rickety.
Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schmidt.
Out of
Mr.
order.
Schumer.
Sorry.
Mr. Scott of Florida.
This is some BS.
Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow.
She thinks she's so cool because she's got a gavel.
Mr. Sullivan.
It's like $12 on Amazon, lady.
Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tuberville. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Vance. Mr. Warner. Mr.
Here
Warnock.
we go. W's. We're almost there.
Ms. Warren. Mr. Welch.
How long are they going to pretend to count
Mr.
for
Whitehouse.
is the question.
Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
Okay. It looks like the lady in the pink jacket's counting this one. They alternate who's counting. And it was a nice democracy that we had there. Republic. Whatever. Constitutional republic. But it looks like it's on its way out. Of course, that could change in November, but the direction, not great. This is just a small misstep. Look, whoever they were going to put in next wasn't going to do much better, right? So, how about that? What do you think Mayorkas is doing right now? Think he's watching? Do you think he's in the chat? No, I'm just kidding. But do you think he's watching the Senate stream? Or probably not. Sweating somewhere, looking suspicious? Thank you, Mozart, for pulling us through. It looks like the counting is done. Oh yeah, Southpaw. 100%. That gets the old 100. Unreal. Sheesh. It's like they don't want me to have good content or something. You know, if they had a debate and it was a lively discussion about the impeachment of Mayorkas, and there was witnesses called, and Mayorkas was dragged in there, and that would have been some great content. Alas. I mean, they know it's 49-51. Why are they pretending, right? What business is being discussed? "'Tis but a flesh wound." Yeah. I mean, when asked, Southpaw, you know, about the border and how it might affect votes, Mayorkas says he doesn't understand the question. Unreal. And the most fleeting answer, or like the weakest one, but it's like the only one that even, they're like, oh, all these people are going to pay taxes. Your troopers, chat. More voters because they don't require ID. Yes. But this is a concept that is not something that Mayorkas understands. Yeah. Was it Kennedy? Yep. Yeah, I remember Kennedy is all cross.
On this vote, the
I
yeas
don't
are
hate
51,
anybody.
the nays are 49. The
can
motion
find
is to
grace.
agree to. The Senate, sitting as the court of impeachment, stands adjourned sine die.
What?
Majority Leader is recognized.
For the information of members, there are no further votes today. Now, I remind all members that we have very serious business ahead of us in the next few days, and we'll keep you informed as to schedule as things can get scheduled.
Sorry, chat.
Republican Leader is recognized.
I actually have a pit in my stomach right now. That's sad. I shouldn't be this invested.
The Senate will be in order. Would senators please take their conversations to the cloakroom?
Madam President, we've set a very unfortunate precedent here.
Oh,
This
Mitch
means
is
that
alive.
The Senate can ignore, in effect, the House's impeachment. It doesn't make any difference whether our friends on the other side thought he should have been impeached or not. He was. And by doing what we just did, we have, in effect, ignored the directions of the House, which were to have a trial. We had no evidence, no procedure. This is a day that's not a proud day in the history of the Senate.
No, it's not.
If you want to find her, that'll do.
Madam President.
Senator from Utah is recognized.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to enter into a colloquy with my Republican colleagues.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President.
Senator from Utah would hold. We do not have order in the Senate. I would ask all senators to take their conversations to the cloakroom as well as the staff. The senator would just hold till we have order, please. Senator from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Madam President. What we've witnessed today is truly historic. This has never occurred. Nothing like this has ever occurred.
Right.
You know, under Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6,
You'd think it'd be
we've
more
been given a
clippable
duty.
if it was so.
We've been given the sole exclusive power
historic.
to try all impeachments. Try all impeachments. Not some of them, not just those with which we have happened to agree, not just those that we are happy that the House of Representatives undertook to prosecute, but all. The word try is also significant. It refers to the word trial. It's the same word. It's a proceeding in which the law and the facts are presented to finders of fact in front of
Yeah, Mitch is a sad
judges
slate, but that's better than he
in order
looked all
to
day.
reach an ultimate disposition. In a criminal proceeding, it would be an ultimate disposition culminating in a verdict of guilty or not guilty. We were precluded from doing that job today, and we were precluded from doing so in a way that is not only ahistoric and unprecedented, but also counter-constitutional. Nothing could be further from the plain structure, text, and history of the Constitution than that. So let's look at the arguments that we would have heard, that we could have heard, that we should have heard today, had things unfolded as they were supposed to. Had things unfolded in a manner consistent with the oath that we took, first when we were sworn in as United States Senators. We're all required to take the same oath to the Constitution when we did that, but also the oath that we took just a few hours ago in this very chamber, in this very case.
That's right.
To decide this case impartially. What would we have heard? Well, first and foremost,
So these are the arguments.
regardless of what you think about what a trial consists of or how different people might cleverly define the term, a trial will always, at a minimum, involve lawyers. And unless the person is proceeding pro se, you will always have lawyers there. Or at least one side will always be represented by lawyers, and in 99.9% of all cases, both sides will. You will hear from lawyers. We didn't hear that today. We didn't hear from the committee of individuals appointed by the House of Representatives to be the House impeachment managers or prosecutors. What else would you expect to hear? Well, you'd hear evidence. Evidence would be brought in. Sometimes trials in the Senate involve bringing in evidence in a documentary form. Other times you might have witnesses. We didn't have any witnesses. We didn't have any documentary evidence other than that which was charged. So let's talk about what was charged and what evidence we could have, would have, and should have heard had we done our job today. Well, the accusations in this impeachment trial can be fit into two categories. Category 1 is found in Article 1 of the Articles of Impeachment. Article 1 alleges that Secretary Mayorkas repeatedly, defiantly did the exact opposite of what federal law requires, namely that under myriad circumstances, 8 or 9 different statutory provisions that he violated, he was required to detain people whom he did not detain. But it's not just that he didn't do what the law required, he did the exact opposite of that. Instead of holding them until such time as they could be removed or alternatively adjudicated to have the status, whether under whether in the context of immigration parole or asylum or otherwise, he just released them. And in many cases, gave them work permits. We would have heard evidence about the fact that memoranda issued by Secretary Mayorkas within the Department of Homeland Security didn't just tolerate this result, they instructed this result. We would have heard evidence about the fact that at the outset of the Biden administration, Secretary Mayorkas, when asked what he would tell those traveling through the caravans, those paying many thousands of dollars per head, in some cases tens of thousands of dollars per head, to international drug cartels, instead of telling them don't do it, he said, maybe don't do it yet. Give us a few weeks before we're ready to receive you. Showing intention, a forethought, to facilitate the violation of federal law. We would have heard evidence about how he instructed his own department to violate those rules. We would have heard evidence about how directly contrary to federal law those things are and contrary to his own oath and his own duties. Now, as to Article 1, the Senate chose to dispose of this today by doing something it's never done in any context anywhere close to this, with a point of order that said as follows. The majority leader stood up, defiantly refusing to have the Senate perform its obligations, and raised the following point of order. He said, I raise a point of order that Impeachment Article 1 does not allege conduct that rises to the level of a high crime or misdemeanor as required under Article 2, Section 4 of the United States Constitution is therefore unconstitutional. All right, let's talk about that for a minute. Now, had we been permitted to have a trial, alternatively, had we been permitted to go into executive session, alternatively, had we been permitted to go into closed session, as
they did
several
like
of us
exhaust
moved
almost
today,
everything I can think.
we would have been able to hear arguments about this, about how wrong this is. Because that's what you do when you have a trial. You hear evidence, you hear arguments from lawyers, and when someone makes a legal argument, as Majority Leader Schumer just did, you can consider their implications, and most importantly, consider whether or not the argument is right. Because when we're sworn in a trial of impeachment, our job is to serve as both finders of fact and adjudicators of law relevant to this case. We were denied that opportunity. So while we're exploring what we would have heard had we gone to trial, had we done our job, let's also explore what would have happened in a real trial had somebody made an actual motion and we've been permitted to do our job. Well, look, first and foremost, this is patently absurd to argue that a willful refusal to obey the law that one has a sworn solemn obligation to perform is somehow not impeachable. We don't have to look too far in order to find support for the conclusion that this is an illegitimate, unwarranted, unsubstantiated claim, one that's directly contrary to law. In fact, we don't have to look further than President Biden's own lawyer, the Solicitor General of the United States, who holds a special position within our federal government, performs functions that many people mistakenly associate with the Attorney General. But it is, in fact, the Solicitor General who is the United States government's chief appellate advocate and chief advocate before all proceedings in the U.S. Supreme Court. There was an exchange in a case argued last term in the Supreme Court of the United States called United States versus Texas. In that case, the Supreme Court heard arguments from the state of Texas about whether or not this administration's approach toward these same provisions of law is acceptable, whether or not they could challenge them. Now, unfortunately, the Supreme Court reached a conclusion with which I strongly disagree, and the Supreme Court concluded ultimately that the state of Texas lacks standing to challenge federal policy along the lines of what we're discussing today, notwithstanding the fact that it's conduct that inflicts substantial harm on the state of Texas and its residents. But the important part that we should have been able to argue here today is the exchange that occurred at oral argument between Justice Kavanaugh and Elizabeth Prelogar, Solicitor General of the United States, in her capacity as Solicitor General, as the Biden administration's chief appellate advocate and chief advocate before the United States Supreme Court. Justice Kavanaugh asked her a number of questions at oral argument, and on page 50 of that argument transcript, some of that discussion ensues. He asks the following: if a new administration comes in and says we're not going to enforce environmental laws, we're not going to enforce labor laws, your position, I believe, is that no state and no individual and no business would have standing to challenge a decision to, as a blanket matter, not just not enforce those laws, correct? Here's what Solicitor General Prelogar says. Quote, that's correct under this court's precedent, but the framers intended political checks in that circumstance. You know, if an administration did something that extreme and said we're just not going to enforce the law at all, then the president would be held to account by the voters, and Congress has tools at its disposal as well. So this argument continues on to the next page, in which Justice Kavanaugh says what are the exact tools that Congress has to make sure that the laws are enforced. And Solicitor General Prelogar answers. She says, well, I think Congress obviously has the power of the purse, and she goes on to explain how this is relevant. And then this goes on until we get to page 53, and then at page 53, Justice Kavanaugh jumps back in.
Mike Lee.
And says, I think your position is, instead of judicial review, Congress has to resort to shutting down the government or impeachment or dramatic steps of some sort or another. Solicitor General Prelogar responds by saying, well, I think that if those dramatic steps would be warranted, it would be in the face of dramatic abdication of statutory responsibility by the executive. So she just acknowledged exactly what has happened here, and she acknowledged that is exactly the moment at which the impeachment power becomes very relevant. Lest there be any doubt on that, this stuff was settled not just in 1789, when we adopted the Constitution, and when the framers used the language that they did. But remember, the framers were not operating in a vacuum. They were not writing on a blank slate. They were incorporating legal terminology that had been in use for centuries. In fact, Justice Story, in his treatise on the Constitution, discusses this very kind of thing and explains in section 798 of his famed treatise, written not so very long after the Constitution itself was written, that we got this stuff from England, that the British knew what impeachment meant, and they understood what would constitute a high crime or misdemeanor. In section 798, Justice Story acknowledges that there was precedent, there was an understanding at the time of the founding that recognized that you would have an impeachable offense if, among other things, a Lord Admiral would have neglected the safeguard of the sea. They didn't have a Homeland Security Secretary then, not in America, not in Britain. But this is really analogous. This is the exact same thing. Somebody who had a duty to do a certain thing under the law defiantly refused to do so. Those are arguments we could have and would have and should have heard today had we had an actual trial, had we been permitted
so the outcome
even
of
to
a
go into
trial would have
executive
just been
session,
removal
or even
from
to go into
office
closed
and then
session.
kind of
Why
not
closed
allowing
session? We
Mayorkas to hold
have to do it in
public
closed
office in the
session.
future. So this wouldn't
You
be.
see, the standing rules
there are no criminal
for impeachment in this body preclude us from having this very kind of
charges
debate.
here, really. Not
so,
really.
When Majority Leader Schumer made this argument,
no chance of incarceration.
to the great shock and
let's
surprise
say.
of all of us, we wanted to warn the body and have this debate. He wouldn't let us do that. The Democrats voted us down. So that's That's Article 1 in a nutshell. Article 2 of the Articles of Impeachment, what do those get to? Well, those are interesting because those deal with false statements, knowingly false statements repeatedly made by Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas to Congress.
Breach of trust.
To Congress as it's performing its oversight responsibilities. He lied to Congress according to the allegations of the Articles of Impeachment in Article 2. To my great shock, look, he was dead wrong as to Article 1. But if he was dead wrong as to Article 1, he was deader than a doornail, whatever that means. 10 times more dead as a doornail as to Article 2 than he was to Article 1. Why is that? Well, because they allege in Article 2 that Secretary Mayorkas knowingly made false statements. Knowingly making false statements is a felony offense. It's punishable as a crime, as a felony federal offense under, among other things, 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. It's routinely charged, prosecuted, and is the basis for lots of convictions for a felony offense. You can go to prison for a very long period of time for that. Now, for Chuck Schumer to argue... Yes.
I just want to be able to be sure I understand.
Kennedy from Louisiana.
I thought I heard...
Microphone.
Madam President, I asked Senator Lee if he would yield to a question. I thought I heard Senator Schumer argue today that lying to the United States Congress was not a high crime or misdemeanor, and therefore could not be the basis for an article of impeachment. Did I hear that correctly?
That is exactly what he said. That is exactly what he said when he made this motion, because he stood up and he said, I raise a point of order that impeachment Article 2 does not allege conduct that rises to the level of a high crime or misdemeanor.
So, even though lying to the United States Congress is a felony, under the precedent that the majority leader and our Democratic colleagues established, it's not a high crime or misdemeanor? Is that what we did?
That's crazy.
That is precisely what the precedent established today stands for. That is, we've effectively, by this vote that the Democrats forced through, not even allowing us to debate this, and this is why I raised a point of order this is why I made a motion that we go into closed session to discuss this, because we've now set a precedent that effectively, very arguably effectively immunizes from impeachment, making a false statement to Congress.
May I ask one more,
Yes.
Senator?
Yes, please.
Well, I'm trying to follow the Senate Majority Leader's logic. What do you have to do to get impeached now? I mean, a felony is not sufficient. What's above a felony?
Well, let's see. Obviously, spreading what they deem misinformation on the internet might be a felony. I suppose at some point.
But it takes, as I understand it, Senator, you're a legal scholar, it takes more than a felony now.
A high crime or misdemeanor.
Yeah, it
takes more than a high crime or misdemeanor.
Who's on first? What's on second? I don't understand any of this, and I'm very, very worried and would like your thoughts or others' thoughts about the precedent that our Democratic colleagues, in their haste to sweep this under the rug, may have established.
Yep.
Will the gentleman from Louisiana yield for an adjunct question
With
to
pleasure.
his question?
With pleasure.
So the law says that lying to Congress is a felony. Since we're no longer using impeachment as a means to address someone who's lying to Congress, how does Congress prosecute or address someone who deliberately lies to Congress now that the Senate has swept away through this precedential action today the opportunity to use impeachment for that purpose? Thank you.
Yeah, and I'd love to respond to that point briefly, if I could. What we've done is to effectively immunize this against impeachability. Immunize making false statements. And going back to the original question, I don't know, maybe aggravated first-degree murder with heinous, atrocious, and cruel conduct as aggravators. Maybe that's still a high crime or misdemeanor. That remains to be seen. But keep in mind, particularly with the fact that they already set aside Article 1, and they've already said that that's out of bounds as well for impeachability. The Supreme Court has said pretty much nobody has standing to address that. What are we left with? And getting back to the question from Senator Lummis, this is a phenomenally dangerous precedent to have set here, specifically with regard to the false statements. Because what does that do to our oversight hearings, where we rely routinely on testimony provided under oath by cabinet secretaries and other administration officials? What does that do? What incentive structure does that create? What perverse incentives does that create for them to lie?
With this, Senator Gill?
Yes.
Are you aware, here's a question, are you aware of the fact that President Clinton was impeached? And one of the charges against him was lying under oath in a civil lawsuit. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Okay, so you can be impeached for lying under oath in a civil lawsuit, but apparently you can't be impeached for lying to Congress about how you do your job. So here's what I'll give Senator Schumer the benefit of the doubt, Senator Kennedy. He's saying that the fact pattern here apparently doesn't rise to the level of high crime or misdemeanor, that we don't have a situation, it's a policy disagreement. We've taken a policy disagreement in the House and tried to turn it into impeachment. Well, here's a question for you, Senator Lee. Are you aware of the fact
Throw up a little reminder
that
for you
2
again.
days ago,
Bam!
2 days ago, Secretary Mayorkas was asked about the parole of the man alleged to have killed Laken Riley, Mr. Ibarra. Why was he paroled and how he was paroled?
Didn't know.
Under the parole statute, 212D5, there's 2 ways parole can be granted. Unique humanitarian need, circumstance. Your mother's dying. Something's going on bad. You need to get into the country on a temporary basis, or special benefit to the United States. That means you're a witness in a probably cartel trial. Those are the only 2 reasons you can be paroled. And 2 days ago, no, yesterday, Secretary Mayorkas said he did not know why Mr. Ibarra was paroled.
Not familiar with the details
Which one
of
of the
that
2
case.
was it?
Lies.
This was a question from Congressman Bishop. He said, I didn't know.
It's crazy.
At the same time he said, I didn't
I don't know.
I had the file.
Not to
and
my
it
knowledge.
says, subject was paroled due to detention capacity at the Central Processing Center in El Paso, Texas.
Wild.
In the file, he was paroled because they didn't have any space for him. Senator Schumer, this is illegal. The Secretary of Homeland Security cannot just add a condition.
They're pretending
to the
like
statute.
Schumer's still there.
The statute doesn't allow you to give parole because you're full. And the reason this man was given parole is not because of the statutory requirements, because we'd run out of space, because we got more illegal immigrants than we can handle, and the rest is history.
Someone was asking how I felt about the
He
allegations.
gets paroled, he goes to New York.
Yeah, this would have been
gets
good to
convicted
hear.
of a crime. He goes to Georgia, and he's accused of murdering this lady. Seems to me that would
Jorge,
be
if you're still
something
here,
we should
the needle's
argue
just tipping
over
more
as
and
to whether or
more
not you should
towards
lose your
impeachment for
job.
me.
Because you got a statutory requirement limiting your authority to parole people, and in your own file,
haven't already.
Exhibit
The subscribe
A,
button, not the button that you're
paroled
right in the middle of
because
the
the
screen,
place was
but there's
full.
a real button somewhere.
This happened 2 days ago.
I'm not going to tell you where it is. Just kidding.
So this gives kangaroo courts a bad name. This is a friggin' joke. We have a nation under siege. 1.9 million people have been paroled. Are you telling me they do an individual analysis on all the people? In February 2023, November 2023, I asked him, Secretary Mayorkas, Do you do a case-by-case analysis? Senator, we comply with the law. So you're telling me of all the 240,000, the ones in front of us, you determine they meet the criteria of urgent humanitarian need or significant public benefit? And he said yes. This was in November, under oath to me, when I questioned, I don't believe you. I don't believe you're doing an individual analysis on this stuff. You're doing blanket parole and you're paper whipping this stuff. It turns out he gave false testimony to the Congress. Whether he lied or he's just doesn't know what he's doing, I don't know. You should be impeached either way. If you don't know what you're doing, you should be kicked out because you don't know what you're doing. But the man that we're talking about is the one charged with murdering this young lady who was going on a jog. If that's not important to the American people to find out how that happened, and should somebody be held responsible, what the hell is? You can talk about why we impeached Trump and Clinton. Was it worthwhile? Did it matter?
It's true.
Was it all political? You cannot say this is not important.
Maybe Schumer
to
would
say
care
that how
more
we're
if it was
doing,
someone
he's doing his
that he
job
knew.
is not important to the American
Full
people.
stop.
Tell that to the Riley family. This is not an academic debate. The policies of this administration
Schumer is just such a snake.
being carried out by Secretary Mayorkas are illegal. The man charged with killing Laken Riley was illegally released into this country by DHS. That should be something we argue about in the Senate as to whether or not you keep your job. It's been swept under the rug. There will be an election in November. This is the only chance you have to get this right to the American people. We had a chance today to hold somebody accountable, finally, for all the rape and the murder and the drugs. The largest loss of life in America is fentanyl coming through the border for young people. How many more people have to be die, raped, or murdered before somebody is held accountable?
It has to be
We had a chance here,
someone of,
and our Democratic friends swept it under the rug.
That's how it is.
Because they're more concerned about the November election.
If the cartel went after
than
Hunter
protecting the
Biden,
American people.
we'd see real change.
This is a sad day for the Senate.
Listen, cartel, no.
Law-trained kangaroos
You agree with
everywhere
what
are
I said?
going
That's
to be
my question.
offended by the use of the term kangaroo court. In fact, the entire marsupial world will be offended by this. Senator Marshall, you have a question?
Yield. Yes. It certainly seems to me that today 51 of our friends across the aisle voted to not have a trial. Make note of this, that every person voted in that trial was a vote for an open border.
Yes.
It was a vote to tell Laken Riley's family that the life of their daughter didn't matter. It was a vote to tell the 250,000 families that lost a loved one to fentanyl it doesn't matter. But what struck me as the clock struck midnight here and we lost that vote, I feel like the Senate was gutted. That we lost part of our powers. You know, in high school we were taught, high school government, we were talked about checks and balances. And one of the checks and balances that the legislative branch had on the executive branch was this impeachment process. And I want to ask my colleague from Texas, why do I feel like I've just been gutted right now, like the entire Senate, that this body has been gutted of a power that we're never going to get back, that impeachment going forward may mean nothing. Am I wrong?
I'm sorry to say that my friend from Kansas is not wrong. In the 237 years of our nation's history, I don't know that there has been a more shameful day in the United States Senate than today. What we just witnessed was a travesty. It was a travesty to the United States Constitution, and it was a travesty to the American people. And it's important to understand why the Democrats did what they did. We're here on the Senate floor right now, but I want the record to reflect I'm going to do a very accurate count of the number of Democrats who are with us. That would be 0.
Okay, that answered
other
that
than the
question.
presiding officer, and somebody has to preside. Not a single Democrat senator chose to come to this floor and listen to one word of evidence. when it comes to the Constitution, the Democrats concluded that Joe Biden and Alejandro Mayorkas, defying federal law, ignoring the text of the statute, deliberately releasing criminal illegal aliens over and over and over again, that's just hunky-dory. You can't impeach him for that. Every Democrat just voted. By the way, every cabinet member, guess what? You've just been given a blank slate. Ignore the law. When Democrats are in charge of the Senate, the entire cabinet could ignore the law. It is no longer impeachable. In Democrat Wonderland, when a member of the executive branch openly defies the law. By the way, every Democrat just voted that way. They didn't hear one word of argument. The majority leader didn't stand up and say, here's the reason why it's okay. No, he didn't present that argument. They didn't read a brief. Nobody wrote a brief. They didn't care enough to know what Senator Lee just laid out, that the Biden Department of Justice went in front of the U.S. Supreme Court and said if the executive defies the law, the answer is impeachment. The willingness of every Democrat to be blatantly hypocritical. Just last year, the Biden Justice Department said, no, you can't sue in court. When we, the Biden administration, defy the law, the answer is impeachment. In like three-card money. Every Senate Democrat said, no, the answer is not impeachment. I don't know what it is. Actually, I do know what it is. There's only one answer left, which is everyone who is unhappy about the open border shows up in November, and to use the phrase, throw the bums out. Because if you're not willing to do your job, is there not one senator on that side of the aisle who cares enough to honor the Constitution? By the way, the second article they threw out said lying to Congress is not a high crime or misdemeanor, it's not impeachable. Now, as the senator from South Carolina pointed out, Bill Clinton was impeached for lying under oath. And you know what happened? That he was ultimately acquitted? But after a full trial where they heard the evidence, where the Senate did its job. By the way, one of the impeachment managers was Senator Graham, who presented that evidence right here on this floor. And you know what? Before Bill Clinton, there's a guy named Walter Nixon. You may not know who Walter Nixon is. Walter Nixon was a federal judge who was convicted of perjury. He was from Mississippi. He was convicted of perjury in front of a grand jury. And he was impeached. And it went to the Senate, and the Senate convicted him and removed him from the bench. So you want to know what the precedents were prior to today? You commit a crime, lying under oath, perjury, it is a high crime or misdemeanor that is impeachable. No more. Because understand the Democrats' rule here. This is not about the Constitution. None of them care. By the way, we repeatedly moved. Let's go into debate. Hear the other side of the argument. Nope. Look, the famous three monkeys, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. That's just evil, what they did. They don't want to know because they don't care, because it's not about the Constitution. It's not about the law. It is about political expediency. But every bit as violent as what they did to the Constitution was, it's even more offensive what they did to the American people.
Yes.
Last year, 853 migrants died crossing illegally into this country. That's almost 3 a day.
To be impeached.
You go down to the southern border, you go down to Texas, which the Democrats don't bother to do because they don't care about the people dying.
What's going on?
And you see photograph after photograph that Texas farmers and ranchers are finding of dead bodies on their property. Many of my colleagues here have been down there with me, have seen the elderly people the human traffickers have abandoned, have seen the pregnant women the human traffickers have abandoned, have seen the infants and toddlers left to die. The Senate Democrats just told the American people they don't give a damn about the bodies and the people who have died the last 3.5 years, and they don't give a damn about the people that are going to die next week. Next week, more migrants are going to die. When we brought 19 senators down to the border, we went out on a boat in the Rio Grande. We saw a man floating dead in the water. Senator Lee was there. Senator Kennedy was there. He had died that day. The Democrats just told the American people they don't care. When you go down to the border and you look at the children who've been brutalized.
Which traitor? There's a few of them.
Just about
Bob
all of us here.
Menendez, Joe Biden, Alejandro
tell you, when
Mayorkas.
you look in the
It's a
eyes
station, not really an office.
of a little girl or a little boy who's been abused by traffickers. And you see it. You see the pain.
So
you
what
see
you
the
missed
agony
was they
of
tabled
children
the impeachment
trapped in
trial,
sex
and so
trafficking.
what they're doing is they're just having
the
a
Democrats
discussion
just said they don't care
about that.
They won't hear
The
the
vote
evidence.
was
They don't
49
care
to
that it's
50
deliberate, and
yeah.
they don't care that it'll
51
happen
to 49
next
in favor
week.
of tabling.
That it'll happen
So
tomorrow.
there's no impeachment trial. It's
Tomorrow
over.
there will be children brutalized because of the Democrats' open border policies, and not a one of them cares.
Thoughts on AOC?
They don't care about the women
yeah.
who are repeatedly sexually assaulted.
She's trying her best, but it's not very
Again,
good.
when you look in the eyes of these
That's
women
my-
coming over.
That's my stream of consciousness thought on AOC.
It's heartbreaking. And
She's
the
trying her
Democrats
best, but
just
it's
said,
not,
we
you
don't
know,
care.
Not very
And they don't care about the more than 100,000
Seems
Americans
like
that died
an okay girl
last
with
year
a
from
political
drug
opinion.
overdose.
She's entitled to it.
The highest in our nation's history.
But Congress is
70% of that is from
kicking
Chinese fentanyl
coverage.
coming across our southern border. And the
your
Democrats said, we don't want to hear about it. We're not interested in the Americans dying. You know what they also don't care about?
Someone
They don't
asked
care
about
about the
16-year-olds
criminals
voting.
that are being
Seems like a
released
bad
day
idea.
after day after day. The Biden administration is releasing murderers and rapists and child molesters, and every week we see another story of somebody being killed, somebody being raped, another child being assaulted by illegal immigrants released by Alejandro Mayorkas and Joe Biden. How shocking is it that there wasn't one Democrat who says, you know, massive human suffering matters.
This is about Mayorkas, the
We ought to hear the
Secretary of the Department of Homeland
How
Security.
shocking is it that there wasn't one Democrat? One!
Let me see if I can.
There are 51 of them on that side. Not a single one could screw up the courage to say, let's do our job, let's hear the evidence. How shocking is it that not a Democrat cares about the terrorists who are streaming across our southern border? The nation of Iran has called for jihad against America. Hamas has called for jihad against America. Hezbollah has called for jihad against America. And Joe Biden and the Democrats have put out a red carpet and said, if you want to murder Americans, come across our southern border, and we, the Democrats, will welcome you. Like many of us
How about that?
on this floor, I was in Washington, D.C. on September 11th, 2001. I remember the horror. I lost a good friend, Barbara Olson, who was in the plane that crashed into the Pentagon. I remember the smell of smoke and sulfur and burning. I remember the agony, and I remember the national unity that came after 9/11. As Democrats and Republicans came together, I don't know that I've ever been more proud of a president than when President George W. Bush stood on a pile of rubble with a bullhorn, talking to firefighters and New Yorkers, and one of the men in the crowd called out and said, "We can't hear you," and he responded, "Well, I can hear you, and soon the whole world is going to hear you as well." We were as one. Today, not a single Democrat was able to mount up the courage to tell the majority leader, you know what, I don't want another 9/11 to happen. The House impeached Alejandro Mayorkas for, among other things, releasing terrorist after terrorist after terrorist. We ought to hear the evidence.
I think someone said there might
I
be
believe
300
today we have a greater
suspected
risk of a major
terrorists
terrorist
wandering
attack
around our
on U.S. soil than at any
country.
point since September 11th. And every Democrat just told the American people it doesn't matter to them to hear the evidence. I appreciate my Republican colleagues who are here, who are willing to hear the evidence, willing to engage, willing to stand up and defend the American people. But you know what? The Democrats who aren't here, they aren't here because you know who's also not here? If you look up at the gallery, the reporters are all gone. A couple of folks in the back, I hope you all right.
And this is one of the reasons why I'm streaming
But the
today,
reporters
is because there's not a lot of talk about any of this stuff. It's
That's
crazy.
the Democrats' plan.
And he's like, okay, the
What is
reporters aren't doing
fascinating-
Operation Mockingbird, of course.
We're presenting arguments.
But where are all the lawyers?
Many of us, particularly those of us in judiciary, but many of us
this is
have
a ghost
presented those arguments over and over and over again in hearings. Not a Democrat argues on the other side. It's an issue unlike any other issue I know of in politics. Listen, if we're
Bush-
arguing about taxes,
Yeah, I mean, I was really
as
young. I was a
Republicans, we say we
teenager.
should cut taxes. It's good for the American people. And you know what Democrats do? They
Yeah.
stand up. We know they're
I've
talking
never
points.
gotten
No,
a straight
tax the
answer
rich.
on the that
Okay, fine, we have a debate.
rocket-looking thing that hit the Pentagon.
We're talking about just about every
That's my
issue.
main point of contention.
The
with
Democrats will
9/11.
argue on the other side. They have their spin. What is fascinating? Where's Dick Durbin, chairman of Judiciary Committee,
I don't
standing
know.
up saying, no, it's not right
Could just be like private contract, military
that
contractors.
migrants are
defense.
dying every day. No, it's not
Who
right that
knows?
children are being assaulted every day. No, it's not right that women are being sexually assaulted every day. No, it's not right that they're releasing terrorists every day. They're not there. Not a Democrat is there. Why? Because you
That's a
cannot
fire
defend
emoji.
it. I'll tell you, South Texas for 100+ years has been a Democrat region of our state. It is turning red with the speed of a freight locomotive because nobody can see the suffering that is unfolding and defend it. And the Democrats, by their silence and by the complicity of the press corps, they are counting on the press corps to write story. Victory for the Democrats, yay!
Yeah.
They got rid of the impeachment trial.
That's exactly right.
That's the headline they want. Understand they don't have a substantive defense. None of them disputes a word we are saying. Not a single Democrat has stood up and said, you know, it's wrong that Laken Riley would still be alive if Joe Biden hadn't let her murderer go. They know it's right.
There's another mother
The
who lost
reason
her
they
daughter.
didn't want
It's
a
under
trial
similar
is they don't want the
circumstances,
American
sued
people to
DHS
hear about
for
it.
$100 million. I hope she gets something. I hope she gets a lot.
And it's our obligation to make sure the American people do.
Is the former governor of Nebraska? I'd love to get your perspective on this.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the colleague from Utah organizing this. My. What have our majority leader and the Democrats in the Senate wrought? They have overturned 227 years
Nebraska
of precedents that my colleagues have talked about. 21 previous impeachments.
Live? That's the
All scheduled for trial.
Oh.
17 came to trial, and the ones that did not because
Ricketts is Texas?
the person who was to be impeached
Is there a delay?
was either expelled or dismissed prior to the trial. To my colleague from Texas's point about the media being complicit, one of the headlines of Politico
Nebraska.
that I was told about
Okay, yes.
said
Sorry.
the trial lasted only 3 hours. There was no trial.
I know Cruz.
There was no trial.
Sorry.
The majority leader decided that he could determine what was unconstitutional and get every single one of his Democrats along partisan lines to vote for it. Said it was unconstitutional. Did not rise
That was Cruz.
to the
with
level
mutton
of
chops,
high crimes
yes.
and misdemeanors. Let me briefly examine that.
Yeah.
Article 1, sent over to us by the House.
Live is Ricketts. This is
Just gonna read the
Ricketts
title.
with the red tie.
Willful and systematic
I know who Cruz is. I swear to
systematic
God.
refusal to comply with the law. That's Article 1. Let me tell you about complying with the law. Prior to this administration, the Trump administration had brought illegal crossings down to a 45-year low. What we have seen since then is an explosion of illegal crossings. Over 1.7 in the first year of the Biden administration, nearly 2.4 in the second, nearly 2.5 in the third. Now, if you count all the people who've tried to cross the border illegal or have crossed the border, including the gotaways, it's 9.4 million people, larger than the population of New York City. 300,000 in just December alone. That is larger than our capital city, Nebraska,
Thank you,
Lincoln.
guys. Thank you, KJ.
The evidence is right there that we're not doing a good job at the southern border.
And also.
And why would that be? Well, because Alejandro Mayorkas
And for those of you who don't know,
in not following the
that's
law.
Alejandro Mayorkas.
In a memorandum Mayorkas sent to Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials in 2021, he said, and I'm going to quote here, the fact an individual is a removable non-citizen, notice he doesn't even say illegal alien, which is what it says in the law. He says the fact that an individual is a removable non-citizen therefore should not alone be the basis for an enforcement action against them. Basically saying just because you broke the law doesn't mean we have to enforce the law. That right there should tell you he is willfully disregarding the law. Absolutely. Or how about the case of parole, where the law says that it's only supposed to be used on a case-by-case basis in situations where the person has an extreme humanitarian need or it's in the best interest of our country.
Here's what we got going on.
Under the Biden or under the Obama and the Trump administrations, it was used an average of 5,600 times. Paroled
The House
5,600 foreigners
acted
in this
like a
country
grand
between
jury.
the Obama and Trump administrations on an annual basis.
You know,
last year
basically
alone,
set up
Mayorkas paroled into
an
this country
impeachment trial to send to the Senate.
1.2
Sent
million
articles of impeachment to the Senate.
whole
That's the
classes
first
of
half
people.
of the battle.
A clear abuse
Now
of
the
the
next
law.
half of the battle
Folks,
should be
when
a
you see
trial in the
instances
Senate.
where
But
the Secretary from Homeland Security is not following the
Schumer,
law, doesn't that
Senate Majority
raise
Leader,
the
just
question,
basically
should we
said,
have a
no,
trial?
we're
Should
not
we
going to have a
examine
trial.
whether or not
No trial will be
he
had.
actually
They
should be
tabled the whole
convicted
thing,
of this? And yet, as my
it's
colleagues have
never
pointed
happened
out,
before.
not a single
There's been
Democrat,
22
partisan line,
impeachment
said no,
processes of
that is not
officials like
willful
Mayorkas in the
disregard of the
past.
law.
Every single one of them
Let's
have
move on to
gone
Article
through a
2.
trial or they resigned before
Article
that
2,
happened. And this has
again,
never
I'm just
happened
going to
before. So that's
read
why
the
this
title
is
of
a
this.
strange situation. Strange that the press
Sent
isn't
over.
covering it.
Says breach of public trust.
Breach of
public trust.
Told you.
Well, what does that mean? How about misleading Congress? Wouldn't that
Yeah,
be a
there's
breach
no balance.
of
This
public
is not
trust?
checks and balances. This is
On April 28th, 2022, Mayorkas testified
not
repeatedly in front of the House Judiciary Committee that DHS possessed the operational control of the southwest border, including in accordance with statutory definition. But I just told you how the number of people crossing the border had exploded. My colleague from Texas did a great job of talking about the human suffering this created. If we had been allowed to have a trial, we would have heard from Border Patrol agents who would have come up and testified personally that the border was not secure. I have been down to that border as well, 4 times. I've seen the people coming across. That border is not secure.
Yeah.
In the last trip down there,
Brian,
it was mostly
100.
Hondurans, but it was a couple from Moldova on the Russian border that had paid to get across to our border because the whole world knows it's open. This is absolutely what we are talking about.
That's why if you
That
aren't
this
already,
is
hit that
why we
subscribe
have
button.
to hear the evidence to
hit the
go
bell,
and
'cause I'm gonna
determine
do
whether or
this
not
more
there
and
is
more
guilt
this
or
year.
innocence.
Could
The
be
Democrats have denied
important.
it, and it is to the detriment of our Constitution and our country that we are not being allowed to have a trial, to examine the evidence,
Seems to be
and
a
determine
gap
whether or not
in this kind of
Alejandro
coverage.
Mayorkas is guilty and whether or not he should be impeached.
And then you look at the early adopters of YouTube, like Legal Eagle. He's
I
a DC
think
attorney. He's
the
going to have an
few
insider
things I've
perspective.
laid out
And you look at
here
people like
this afternoon
Dr. Mike, and he's like a
go exactly to we should
pharma
examine the
mutant
questions.
doctor, and he's just pushing.
And the Democrats chose
all these
not
major
to even
figures are just
ask the
not
questions
representative of.
before
I
they
feel like,
dismissed
you
us
know.
entirely. Thank you to my colleague from Utah
So here
for
I
giving me the
am.
opportunity to be able to address these issues.
Thank you. Before he had his name changed legally for purposes of this chamber to the junior senator from Missouri, Attorney General Eric Schmidt was one of the nation's leading legal minds engaged in this problem, engaged in trying to address the lawlessness at our southern border brought on by the policies of this administration. I'd love to hear his perspective on what happened today.
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, I take this in 2 parts. I think it is important for us to actually digest, for the folks here watching or in the gallery or the press folks who are here who've left, to really understand what happened today. Because what happened today wasn't some disagreement about the number of amendments we might have on an appropriation bill or whether or not some vehicle is going to be a priority or not.
Impeachment is hardwired.
What was
into the
established
Constitution.
today was a new precedent, something that had never taken place in this chamber in the history of our republic. What the Senate Democrats decided to do with a simple majority was to bulldoze 200 years of precedent that said something very simple, that this chamber would honor our constitutional obligation and conduct a trial to hear the evidence. There's no real debate. We were to hear the evidence from witnesses, counsel is present. There's a whole process, there's a whole procedure that's been established, finally wrought throughout the ages, that we were to honor. When we raise our right hand, when we get sworn in, to honor. When we got sworn in today, to honor as United States senators. That's all gone now. Maybe forever. I don't see a circumstance now. You heard the parliamentary inquiries asking if a precedent had ever been established for this or that. 100 years from now, when somebody else has Harry Truman's desk, if I remember to carve my name in it before I die, we'll have this desk. I don't know that person's name. I don't know their background or what their life experience will be. But they'll know what happened today. They'll know that the United States Senate under Chuck Schumer, who will go down as one of the worst U.S. senators in American history because of his actions,
And one of the longest
we'll know that we just blew off
standing
important
senators.
duty
It's insane.
to
Insane.
conduct a trial. It wasn't, an idea, and to paraphrase my friend from Louisiana, it wasn't some, gamer bro with a tweet. These were articles
No problem.
of
That's exactly why I'm doing it,
voted
Brian.
on by
Thank
the
you.
people's
It
representatives.
seems like a big gap.
Representatives in the House of Representatives walked over here and delivered. And so Chuck Schumer and the Democrats who voted for that, they're going to have to own that.
YSL trial, but that's so boring.
And to paraphrase
Believe it or not, it has
something
moments, but it's very
the
stop
senator
and go.
from Kentucky said just a few years ago, I think they're going to regret it, and I think they're going to regret it sooner than they think. So having said that, what was this trial supposed to be about? And as the senator from Utah mentioned, when I was Attorney General in Missouri, we brought the first lawsuit against the Biden administration for their actions at the southern border. When they decided to undo remain in Mexico. We were successful for a while. But what came out of that was a lot of what you might have read in Article 1 of the impeachment that were brought over. A lot of those were from, arguments were from that case. And as an interesting little side note, when we won, when we had an
this is already
injunction
over,
in place, actually, for the Biden
unfortunately.
administration
This
to
is
keep
just
this
like
very
a
important protection in place, they
a
ignored it. We had to
debrief
go
or
back
an
in front of the judge
after-action review.
time and time again
It's
to
already
get
there's
them
no impeachment
to
trial.
abide by the
There's
law.
not going to be one.
But what
And I
we
don't
have
think if they
found
can
out from
bring
this
another,
administration and Secretary Mayorkas
impeachment
specifically
proceeding before
is he is willing, he
November,
himself is
so
willing
moot.
to subvert the law,
completely
to believe that he is above the law.
It's not hopeless, right? Every single
lie and to commit a
House
felony that this
of
chamber now
Representatives seat is up
has
for
said
re-election,
doesn't rise to the
and
level of a high
33
crime
Senate
misdemeanor
seats,
forever.
and the
That is the
presidency.
precedent forever.
So I mean, every 4 years is a real
So,
chance to
the human
turn it
toll
around. And man,
of
they say
this
the pendulum
lawlessness
always
at the border
swings.
that
It
has
doesn't
been
swing now.
overseen
Whew.
by Secretary
I don't know
Mayorkas
what they're talking
is
about.
devastating.
Yeah.
Thousands of people
The
die
past 4 years have been pretty bad.
every month.
I don't know if
for
you've
fentanyl
made any
uses or
changes to your
overdoses.
grocery shopping or eating habits.
We have a
will
ticking time
stretch
bomb
a
in
single
this country
yogurt for days now.
with the
Just
national
saying.
security threat. We don't know who 2 million people are. 9 million people have come here illegally. Most of them have been told, please show up for a court date sometime in the 2030s. That's not going to happen. But 2 million of them, we don't know who they are. We don't know where they're from. We don't know where they're at.
Yeah.
We're seeing a record number of Chinese nationals come across just in California alone. People from all across the world coming here because they know our border is
trains are
wide open, and it's
derailing.
not by accident.
We're seeing boats crash
And
into bridges.
whatever the motivations are,
and planes are falling apart
Secretary
in the sky.
Mayorkas' memo and instruction to his employees to ignore the law The immigration law in this country, the snapshot is, if somebody comes here illegally, they're detained, they're deported, unless some adjudication exists, like asylum claim is processed. 9 out of 10 of those are bogus. That had been the law of our country, the law of the land, for a very long time among Republican and Democrat administrations. No longer. Because Secretary Mayorkas decided to instruct his employees to subvert that law. If you want to change it, come here. If you want to change a shall to a may, that's what we're supposed to do. That's what the Article 1 branch is supposed to do. Just like the Article 1 branch here in the Senate is supposed to hold people accountable who are in high positions of government. It is our remedy. And as the back and forth in that United States versus Texas and Missouri case from Justice Kavanaugh to the Solicitor General of the United States indicated, what is the remedy here? And the Department of Justice's own lawyer said, well, they have the remedy of impeachment, but I guess we don't actually have that anymore. And so I know that in these 24-hour news cycles, things move on quickly. Tomorrow we're going to be on
Are they even covering
FISA, there's national security stuff, and it'll be easy to sort of, I think, for many, to sort of wipe today away. But it won't go away. It's a stain on this institution.
The story is out there.
It
The
diminishes
Senate
this
Democrats
body.
kill
It is
impeachment
why
trial of the HHS chief,
I stood up to
Alejandro
object
Mayorkas,
to
an
a
unprecedented move.
ridiculous
That's the move.
idea
That's
that
the story.
somehow we're supposed to negotiate away our constitutional duty. That isn't up for grabs. That's our job. Oh, thank you, Senator Schumer, for giving us a half hour to talk about this. No thanks. Not for me. Now, would I do that on some amendment to an approach bill? Probably not. But when Senator Schumer wants to set our constitutional order on
That's
fire,
a 100 there, SoCal.
I will stand up and I will object. And I know many other people share that point of view. There is no structure to the arson you're committing. So I appreciate the inquiry or this back and forth we're having with the senator from Utah, because sadly,
could be right.
This
Matt.
is all we're
That
left
could
with.
be true.
So many powers of individual senators have been given away over the years.
The train derailments were weird, especially after
This
that movie.
institution is no longer
Do you remember?
the
what was it
world's
called?
greatest
White
deliberative
Noise?
body.
It's a train derailment in
It's
East
kabuki theater.
Palestine. A week later.
With
Train
fewer
derailment in
powers
East
now
Palestine.
individual senators have.
Is that a message
And
or is that a coincidence?
fewer powers that we've been given by our founders as an institution. For what? For what? A couple of bad days, a couple of news cycles? Congratulations. Congratulations, Chuck Schumer. You're going to own that. And every single Democrat that voted for it will too. So the border crisis isn't going away. It still exists. The Senate lost an opportunity here to hear evidence to hold someone accountable today. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Excellent remarks. There are some days that one wishes one could live over. This is a day that will live in infamy, and a day that future generations will wish had gone differently. We've got a friend and colleague. Our friend and colleague, the senior senator from Wisconsin, has many titles in the Senate, titles of distinction. He is the Prince of Plastics, the maven of manufacturing, the connoisseur of cheese curds. He is also, among other things, someone who's identified himself as the chancellor of charts, showing the profound depth of our border security crisis. He's been working on this ever since he first became the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee back in 2015. He's built on these charts, and he's built on them in a way that has resulted in them catching fire. You'll now see politicians all over the country at every level of government, and I mean every level of government, utilizing his charts because they're the best in the business. Let's hear from him now.
Well, I thank my colleague from Utah. I was not aware of all those titles, but I'll accept them. If we would have had a trial, and it's a travesty we haven't. I mean, there's been great damage done to our Constitution, to this institution, by our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, because they didn't want the American people to see this. Now, I've described this chart. Had we had a trial, this would have been the irrefutable DNA evidence that proved the crime. There's no way you can take a look at the history of illegal entry in this country and not recognize that what has happened under the Biden administration, under Secretary Mayorkas, is nothing less than an utter catastrophe. Yesterday, I spent about 10, 15 minutes on the floor going through the history, the cause and effect that this chart shows. But what I really want to point out today is what the Democrats did not want us to reveal. Because what this chart shows is that this was purposeful. This was willful. President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas, our Democrat colleagues here in Congress, in the Senate, they want an open border. They caused this crisis. This didn't just happen. This was a game plan that they implemented. They aided and abetted all the damage, all the destruction, all the crimes that result of this. They have aided and abetted it.
Okay, that's a good point.
But this chart does show the lawlessness started back in 2012.
Is just to drag out all the evidence that they were going to drag out.
Under the Obama administration, under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
They're dragging out that
evidence. This took prosecutorial discretion, which is, again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a prosecutor, but I believe that's supposed to be applied on a case-by-case basis. President Obama took prosecutorial discretion and granted it to hundreds of thousands of people. That is what has sparked every surge in illegal immigration since that point in time. I used to have a chart that just showed unaccompanied children. And prior to the DACA, it was maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 unaccompanied children per year that our federal government had to account for and had to deal with. In 2014, because of DACA, we encountered 69,000 unaccompanied children. 69,000. And even back then, President Obama, when his Department of Homeland Security, his Customs and Border Patrol were dealing with 2,200 illegal immigrants being encountered per day, he declared that a humanitarian crisis. 2,200 people a day. And by the way, I went down to McAllen, Texas, with a bunch of Democrat colleagues in February 2015 during this surge. And people were singing the praises of CBP, of kind of skirting bureaucratic rules and setting up a detention facility. They would protect children. They used chain link fences. Again, we were singing their praises. Democrats were singing the praises of CBP. A few years later, when President Trump had to deal with the crisis, again, sparked by the unlawful DACA memorandum, all of a sudden Democrats were saying it was kids in cages. You notice the double standard? I won't go through all the history, but I will point out President Trump, because the reality of the situation was we were letting children in, we couldn't detain them. You had the Flores reinterpretation that said that children, even accompanied by their parents, couldn't be detained. People around the world noticed that, so they started coming. They started creating fake families. Children are being sold, in testimony for my committee, children are being sold for $81.
So they'll sell their kids to
create a family.
Cartel, and then
a little
the cartel
boy was
gets over
found
the
abandoned
border,
in a field of 100
and then
degrees
they send the
temperatures.
kid back over the
He'd
border
already been
back to
used.
their family.
He created that family.
Like a rental.
The other people got in, and they just left him there. The only identification was a phone number written on his shoe.
They write the phone numbers on, or addresses, or whatever.
President Obama, Secretary Mayorkas, said they had to undo all of President Trump's successful border security provisions because it said those were inhumane.
Yeah.
There's nothing humane about facilitating the multi-billion-dollar business model of some of the most evil people on the planet. The human traffickers, the sex traffickers, the drug traffickers. How many overdose deaths have we experienced throughout America because of this open border policy?
It is wild.
There's nothing humane about that.
Oh, no problem,
When
Matt.
President Trump
My
faced
pleasure.
his peak, is a sharp
fentanyl,
rise,
the images
but
coming
a
out
sharp
of
fall.
Chicago, is it Philadelphia,
In May of
Los
2019,
Angeles.
almost 4,800 people
Trank and the fentanyl.
entered this country illegally. But President Trump
It
did
looks
something
like
about it.
Senator Chuck Grassley's.
He used what the Supreme Court said in the 2018
You know what I mean?
decision, our existing law, that exuded deference to the
Yeah.
president.
I remember that short on AOC.
So even though that presidential
That,
authority had
her
been weakened
exchange
somewhat
with
by
Tony
the Flores
Bobulinski.
reinterpretation of
That
that
was bad.
settlement,
It was,
even with that weakened authority, President Trump took the
RICO,
bull by the
right.
horns, instituted a
RICO
remain in
is a
Mexico,
category.
safe third world countries, had to threaten the president of Mexico
it's
with
a category of crimes.
with tariffs so he would cooperate. But in
Yeah,
12
he's like,
months,
you would just listen.
President Trump went from his peak to his trough. A little more than 500 people a day entering this
Right,
country.
yes. And they
Now, what's
they
interesting about
probably,
this
you
chart,
know,
that
that's
was again
true.
April of 2020. Why did the numbers go up?
Corey, I agree.
Pretty simple explanation. That was in the midst of a presidential campaign, and every Democrat presidential candidate pledged that they would end deportations, they'd give free health care. And the world took notice. People started coming in anticipation of President Biden taking office. And then once President Biden took office, the catastrophe began. And again, President Biden, now he claims he doesn't have the authority. No, he has all the authority that President Trump had to close the border. President Biden, Secretary Mayorkas used that exact same authority purposefully,
I think what you guys are trying to tell me is I need a
to
haircut.
open up the border. So President Biden didn't need more laws. Secretary
funny.
Mayorkas didn't need more laws to
A
fix
couple of
this problem.
Sonic accounts
They
came in
caused
here
the
and made fun
problem.
of me today, too.
They have the authority. We would have been happy to strengthen the authority, to overrule the Flores reinterpretation. They weren't asking for that. All our Democrat colleagues
funny.
wanted was political cover. That's the truth.
It only just
So
kind
we
of
went
got
from
this blowout
humanitarian
look in the
crisis
last
under
couple
Obama of
days.
2,200 people a day. Trump had almost 4,800 people a day, but he fixed it.
That's funny.
President Biden, his record is more than 10,000 people a day in December of last year. 10,000 people a day. During his entire administration, he's averaged 7,800 people in this country illegally because he has welcomed them. He's incentivized them.
Oh.
He wanted an open border. He caused this problem.
I've been making that distinction a lot today between me
And our
and Legal Eagle.
Democrat
Legal Eagle
colleagues
is
would
a
not even
DC
listen
lawyer,
to
and he's going to have that
evidence.
insider perspective, and I have that.
Would not let the House
outsider
managers make
perspective.
their
I'm a-
case.
You know, of the people.
Of
people.
the lawlessness,
We the people.
of the willfulness, of the lying to Congress.
You don't get that a lot. Dr. Mike, too. He's
because
like, take
they
your
didn't
medicines
want
and
the
your
American
boosters.
people to see this.
These are the guys who are like dominating
I've shown this
YouTube.
chart
This
to
is the
Secretary
impetus
Mayorkas.
for
I'll
me
show it to him
joining.
again tomorrow when he comes for our committee. First time I showed this, a couple of years ago, it looked almost as bad. But I asked him, Secretary Mayorkas, don't you recognize this is a crisis? And this is what he's saying, we've got a secure border. He wouldn't say it's a crisis. Well, would you at least admit it's a problem? No, Senator, it's a challenge. Now, I would view that as a lie. I would have liked to have heard the evidence presented by the House managers of other instances where Secretary Mayorkas lied to Congress, which, again, as I thought was definitely pointed out by the Senator from Louisiana, isn't that a felony? And doesn't impeachment only have to be a misdemeanor?
When I
Again,
was,
so there's
when
so
I was
much
in
wrong
college, the Pauly D thing.
in what our Democrat colleagues did
Once or
today by
twice
just summarily,
helped.
cavalierly dismissing these charges.
This isn't a new
It's going to
thing.
come back to haunt our country. But
That's
my
funny.
final point
There
will
could be relation. I don't know. I'm not Italian.
this disaster,
I don't know.
it's on a chart. It's numbers. their colors. But the real disaster is with the individuals who've lost their lives, who've lost loved ones.
I feel like Biden's career is
children
based
who've been
off
raped,
of people feeling bad for him.
Who've been
It's
caught in
like,
the crossfire, the gang wars.
he got in, you know. I don't know if that was a
That's
close one
the
or
real
not,
challenge,
but
or that's the real catastrophe.
tragedy struck, and he has
That's the
just
real problem.
skated on that for
The Democrats
decades.
just today swept under the rug.
I remember
It's a travesty. It
maybe
shouldn't
10
happen.
years ago, my
But we'll continue to prosecute this case.
father-in-law, you know,
right up
would
until
say
November.
something about Biden. He'd go, Biden.
Grateful for
Biden
those
gets a
insights
pass.
that we've had
You know, he's
from
had a
our
tough
friend and
life,
colleague, the
but like
distinguished
that's
senior
I
senator
think
from
you know Biden's
Wisconsin.
taken advantage of that.
You know, when the senior senator from Alabama joined the United States Senate, it was a pleasure to get to know him. It has been a pleasure to work with him ever since then. In fact, I visited our southern border within a few months after he arrived here. And I noticed in him distinct concern, not only for the welfare of the residents of the state of Alabama and all other Americans, but also a genuine concern for those who have been human trafficked into our country by the drug cartels, with the tacit acquiescence and even the affirmative blessing of this administration. I, for one, am glad that
Sean.
Senator Tuberville was not the head coach at the University of Miami when their football team played BYU in the late summer of 1990. Had he been, that game might have turned out differently. But I'd love to get his thoughts on this matter.
It was a pretty good game, by the way.
A very good game.
Thank you. Thank you. For my colleague from Utah, you know, I'm kind of amazed what's happened today. It's been categorized several ways, whether it's kangaroo court or a three-ring circus or organized grab ass. I don't know how you look at it, to be honest with you.
Someone here called it a circus.
It is amazing what we've sat here and watched. We all thought that last few weeks that there was a chance for an impeachment trial of Secretary Mayorkas, but it only lasted a few hours. Historic event in the eyes of every senator, not just
for plagiarism,
but also
so
Democrats. But
Those
one thing
clips are
I want to
hilarious.
say is, you know,
and then he's like
has he
talking down to a
faithfully
reporter like he's the
executed his
smartest guy
duties,
in the room. He's like, I was this, I was that,
of the
and all
United
those things
States
are made up.
Constitution, one that we all put our hand on the Bible and swore to do. But it was amazing to me how this all went down at the end of the day. And it really wasn't Secretary Mayorkas's, he wasn't the only one on trial today, or would have gone on trial, impeachment trial. It would have been every Democrat. Every Democrat here in the Senate, every Democrat in the House, and every Democrat that's running our executive branch, because there's not been one person that has said anything since I've been here in 3.5 years of we need to do something at the border. Not one. Now, we've let in 10 million illegal aliens in the last 3 years. And that data point alone, Secretary Mayorkas intentionally failed to secure the border. I personally asked him one day why he was not at least given a fair chance of closing the border. He says, Senator, we need more money. Well, I looked it up, and his budget is 20% more than what President Trump's Secretary of Homeland Security had. 20%. So, his job is Homeland Security. That's his entire job. Senator Schumer and all the Democrats could have conducted this impeachment trial today, and it would have never seen the light of day after the trial, because we would have not had the votes on our side to impeach Secretary Mayorkas. So instead, the impeachment process is over. The media will stop covering it in a few days. We'll be going back to throwing millions of taxpayer dollars at blue states so they can manage the surge of illegal aliens going to the blue cities all over the country. Just last week, the Department of Homeland Security awarded another $300 million to cities in support of illegal aliens. Today, the city of Denver announced that they would shift $8 million from their law enforcement to taking care of illegal aliens. It's clear that the Biden administration is more concerned with taking care of these illegals than they are about protecting the citizens. So I will ask again,
I
has
like how he
Secretary
says
Mayorkas
illegals.
fulfilled
Lazy
his
illegals.
oath of duty before this body to protect and defend the country against all threats, foreign and domestic? Is our border secure? The answer is simple. He has not, and it is not. Mayorkas has been derelict in his duty. Derelict. Confrontational in his duty to all of us when we've asked him personally what he is doing at the southern border. In voting against his impeachment, our Democrat colleagues they're basically lying to themselves. They're risking the lives of Americans. Senator Schumer and the Democrats can't say that they want to fix the border while trying to save his job. Americans are dying at the hands every day of what's going on from our southern border. Every state's a border state now. It's just not Texas, it's not Arizona and California, every state. My state of Alabama is being overrun with illegal aliens.
Every state's a border
The number of people crossing the border who are on the terrorist watch list is unprecedented. That's what scares me. Listen to our FBI director, he says, we have a major threat to our country. And he said, it is coming. But it doesn't seem like anybody's listening. Nobody's listening that's in charge. Just last week, it was reported that an Afghan on the FBI terror watch list has been in the U.S. for almost a year. He's a member of a U.S. designated terrorist group responsible for the deaths of at least 9 American soldiers and civilians in Afghanistan. 9. ICE arrested him in San Antonio just last year in February. Unfortunately, this known terrorist has been released on bond.
I swear I could type some
and is
days.
now roaming the neighborhoods in the United States of America. It isn't just terrorists. It's always, it's also fentanyl.
Hunters.
We've had
I think
100,000
Hunter has
people a year die in
transcended
the last
politics.
3 years. Last time I looked, that's 300,000 people. It is a crime what's going on. Law enforcement officers in Alabama tell me that they had never heard the word fentanyl until 3 years ago. Not heard the word.
Isn't that
heroin,
crazy?
It was cocaine.
Right.
It was meth. Now it is almost 100%
It is
Just
also
last
in
3
the
years.
epidurals. And
That's
I've
pretty
had
good
3
coincidence.
kids. The first 2 kids, it was not
In
fentanyl
February,
in the epidural.
last,
what? Why?
This past
it's
year,
because OxyContin caught a bad rap. Big Pharma
Secretary
had to
Mayorkas
rebrand,
traveled
and
to
now it's
Austria to
fentanyl.
speak
Oh,
with
it's been
Chinese
around
officials about
forever. Well, guess what?
narcotics efforts. Now, he traveled to Austria to do that.
I'm not.
He
I
discussed
was born
with them the flood
yesterday.
of Chinese.
Every 10 years,
Did
Big
he
Pharma just
discuss
changes
the
the
Chinese
name of
flood
whatever it is that's
of people
killing
coming to our
everybody.
country?
They just tweak it a little bit.
22,000
barbiturates,
Chinese
70s and 80s.
illegals have
heroin,
come into our country
OxyContin,
just in the last 5 months.
perks, whatever
Most
you
of these
wanna call it.
individuals are adult males. And I wonder where we get the idea that there might be a big problem coming to America soon. Yet the media tries to act like all the people that's
Sean,
coming here
that's
from China and all these other
laughed
countries
out
are,
loud.
great people. Some of them probably are, but most probably are not. They're coming here for different reasons.
Yes.
This
It's
is
like,
not a border
what
crisis.
does it take to
It's
get in
turned
trouble for
into
being a
huge
traitor today,
invasion.
is my question.
It's a national security
And I
problem,
don't want to find
and
out
we're having it
personally.
more and more each day. So I just want to
Keep
say
my head
this.
down. But
We
it
have
seems
not
like there's
done
some
our duty here
traitors.
today. We have failed the American people. My phone rings constantly about
Bob Menendez and his gold
protecting
bars.
the sanctity
Biden,
of not just
his
Alabama, but
million-dollar
everybody in
businesses
this country
that don't sell
from what's
anything,
happening at the southern
hold any
border.
property.
Nothing good is happening because of what's happened
What would Corn
from
Five do?
Secretary Mayorkas to the people that have opened these borders. Again, not just southern, but also northern border. That is getting worse and worse. So we failed the American people today.
Absolutely. I
Why?
think about
I
what
don't
Trump
know
said.
that we
a
don't do our
wall, but
job.
not just a wall. It's like
We had
a
a
big,
Republican
nice landmark.
Majority, when I first got
a
here 3 years ago,
magnificent
we
wall.
brought the
Nothing- that's
president
a
of the United
There's
States
a big difference
in an
between,
impeachment trial,
and this is, I ran
and
for
he was a
school board
Republican.
once, and this is a
And
problem.
we put him on trial
You take a
in
nice
this very
school,
room.
and then you put a chain link fence around it. Very
is all
different
politics.
aesthetic than when you take a nice
We
school
broke
and you
something
put like
today
one of
that
those
has never been done in the
iron
history of
bar
this-
fences.
in the history of this school.
The black
I mean,
iron. You know what I'm talking about?
school.
Big, thick iron
I'm
fence.
used to
It's
getting on
nicer.
people
It's-
when their phones ring in
and
the
there's a
classroom
difference.
when I was coaching. But it's never happened before. Now we've set a precedent, and unfortunately, It will
So,
be a
I
precedent
think that
probably
matters.
will be broken many
Everything,
times.
all the little
How
things
is this
matter.
body ever going to be able to hold anybody accountable to anything that they've done wrong here in the federal government?
Thank you, Coach.
Amen.
Another
Right,
one of
ID
our colleagues
requirements
has
and
been
no
a
vote by
longtime
mail
advocate of secure
or drop
borders,
boxes.
who's tireless in her advocacy. He's our friend and colleague, the senior senator from the state of Tennessee. I'd love to get her thoughts on what happened today.
Thank you so much to the senator from Utah for organizing this. You know, Madam President, I think it is so important for the American people to really understand what did happen here today.
What?
And what we saw happen here today is a violation of our oath. The oath that we take, that we are going to abide by the Constitution. Now, those who are watching this, and I would encourage all of my colleagues among us to pull out that Constitution and read Article 1, Section 2, which lays out the process of impeachment for the House of Representatives. And then Section 3 of that Constitution lays out the duty of the Senate in that Constitution. Now, I have a poster up here from 2019. It is Chuck Schumer. This was during
the electronic
Trump
voting systems
impeachment in 2019. Now, Chuck Schumer, who's currently the majority leader, basically made a full-time
I'm not
job
completely on the inside in the know on Mike Lindell's efforts to get rid of electronic voting systems.
Constitutional duty to hold a
But
trial.
I've had people call me up
That's
just
all
this
he
past
talked
week
about for
who
days.
collected
The
petitions
clips are
and are trying to get
all
their
over
county
the
commissions to,
internet. One thing he
ban
repeatedly
electronic
said,
voting machines,
we
and they're
have
getting a lot of pushback from
responsibility
Americans
to
with
let the
disabilities.
facts come
Apparently,
out.
electronic voting machines have some
A
advantages.
responsibility.
I can see that.
Now,
but
we have to say what has changed.
so the county commission said this is illegal, it's against the ADA, against state law or something. Not against state law, it might be against the federal law.
We know what changed for Chuck
So they just
Schumer.
threw that out. And
Because he's
that's like
desperate to
a
hold
free speech
on to the
issue, in my
majority in
opinion, at
this
that
House.
point. You got people collecting
And he
petitions,
did
they want to have a
not
vote on
want
something, a referendum,
some of
if you
the
will.
senators
And the county
who
commission
are
says,
highly contested in their races
unfortunately,
to have to
deadlines
take a vote
part of the issue.
on the
Couldn't
Mayorkas
take it.
impeachment. Why is that, Madam President? It is because the number one
But I heard
issue
that they
with
did get
the
past the
American
deadline
people
phase.
is that open
You never know.
southern
We'll see.
border. And who is it that has regularly lied to this chamber,
The
to
one
the
thing
House,
regarding the right
and to the American
is the
people
grifting. It's so
about
bad
what's
from
going
Mug Club to
on
Trump's.
at the southern border?
Ugh.
It is Secretary Alejandro
There's a Mug
Mayorkas.
Club. What's this?
Repeatedly lied, repeatedly stood before the American people, stood before us in hearings and committees and said, the border is secure. Anyone
Is it the
who
mug
is
shot? What
watching,
are we referring to? Selling
anyone who's ever been to that border knows the border is not secure.
So they've
They
gone
know
through. So I took a
that
course
on
on
the
this. I have some
Mexico side of
background
that
in
border,
voting systems
it
and
is
elections.
being run by the cartels.
And I've
You
observed
can
some
spend an hour
high
with the Border Patrol,
high court
and
election
you
law
will
cases
find
even.
out. Last year, there were people
There's
from
always been
170
it started. Voting started this way, from my
that
understanding.
came to that
Clubs
southern border
somewhere
seeking
in and
entry.
around
Not a
Italy
one of them
with
got
a
here on their
box
own.
and like
They get
marbles
flown to
or
Mexico,
rocks,
they pay the
and they would cast
cartels,
votes to let
and
people
the
in these
cartels bring
clubs.
them over. The
I believe, maybe a
cartels are
black or a
making
white
a fortune.
rock or a marble, something
We
like
are
that.
paying the
And
price.
ever since then, and we're talking
And we're
probably
paying
hundreds,
this price
thousands of
because
years ago,
of the
maybe.
dereliction
I mean, you got to
of
think
duty
the tribes are probably
carried out
doing this in
by
some degree
Secretary
too.
Mayorkas.
But it started with this
The way
box
he's not
of rocks
standing
or
up for the Border
marbles,
Patrol,
and
the
it's
way he's not
evolved over the
standing up
years
for the
to, if
American
you remember,
That is an
20
issue. And yes,
years
a
ago now,
responsibility.
you know,
did we
it was a
have that
system where you had a piece of
responsibility?
paper
You
and you'd
bet
punch
we
holes
do.
in it. The hanging
And
Chad
that
incident.
is
Before
why
that, it was similar.
We are here on
it was
this
like lever
floor
machines.
to talk about this.
But here's the thing: with every
Because
single one
our
of these
border
systems, They're all
When you look at the
susceptible to
drugs,
fraud
the
and
fentanyl
tampering.
that are coming across that border. And
Interesting,
moving
right?
into communities
So
across
voting, I
this
think,
state,
is an old,
this
and at least this is
country.
the course that I took, and it was from
Every
a guy
state,
who,
a border
you know, I
state,
got to take it with a
every
grain of
town,
salt
a
because this is
border
the
town.
guy who got on
Every
TV like right
single
after the presidential
family
election said it was one of the most
affected
secure
or
elections in the
worried
history. It was like without ever
about the
looking at
consequences
anything.
of the border.
Completely irresponsible and reckless to say.
Thousands of Americans
And I was like, that guy is
dead
dead to
from
me now. I thought he was an
fentanyl
election
poisoning.
security
Other Americans
professional.
that have become angel parents because their children, their spouses have been
Okay, you want to
killed
watch
in
this
auto
directly? Let me
accidents
help you out with that.
by criminal, illegal
I think it just should be Senate.gov.
aliens. What they have done to this country by opening
This
that
is
border,
live
and you
floor
know the sad
activity.
thing about this, it is very intentional. This is their border policy. They intend to do this. So looking at the drugs, looking at the crime and the gangs, and then of course looking at the human trafficking. On Mayorkas'
Yeah, everything
watch,
requires
and
an idea.
Madam President, this is something that is so important for the American people to know. In Tennessee, we have several groups that work on human trafficking and seek to rescue women and girls and children that are being trafficked, sexually trafficked. The exploitation of these children. And we know that is driven by the cartels. The cartels have turned human trafficking in this country from a $500 million a year industry. Over the last 3.5 years,
No.
it has become a 13 billion with the B. People are being
So is it
trafficked,
vote by
and the
mail? Or
children
is voting on the ballot by
being
mail on the
used
ballot?
as-
Is that what you're saying?
as aids for these
And then you never got the
traffickers.
ballot
They're
by the
being
mail.
recycled. And these precious children have their name, they have the contact name and the phone number
Written on
in
their
indelible
backs.
ink, written on their backs,
Yeah.
written on their arms, because the cartel uses these children to get cartel members across the border posing as families. And then, once that cartel member is in the U.S., they turn that child loose. And then the child gets sent back. That is disgusting. But because of Biden and Mayorkas and the open border, that is what is happening. Now, even worse, we have an issue that Secretary Mayorkas claims he knew nothing about, and it was the loss of 85,000 migrant children. Now, we've got 400,000 migrant children that have been turned over to the federal government under Secretary Mayorkas. Out of this, 85,000 of those children cannot be accounted for. We've asked Secretary Becerra.
I think they could
we've asked
absolutely have a deal
Secretary
with Biden.
Mayorkas, where are
Don't
these
ask
children?
101.
They do not know. They do not know if these 85,000 children
I mean,
are
wait,
dead
basically,
or
let's ask
alive.
ourselves this.
They do not know if they've
Is it
been
possible that
attached
Hunter Biden has
to drug
connections to the
mules
cartel?
or drug traffickers.
And is it possible that they
or
struck a deal
if
at some
they've been
point?
put into gangs,
I mean, all we
labor
know
groups.
about,
What we
you
did
know,
find out from
Ukraine
some
and Russia and
reporters, Madam
China. What do we not
Secretary,
know about?
is this.
'Cause if
we
we're
found
saying-
out that some of these children were working in
If we're saying that
slaughterhouses in the
Hunter has no
night.
connections to Mexico or
That's
let's
what we
say
found
Colombia,
out. Oh, by the way,
I think that's a
that
stretch.
was from a New York Times reporter. This situation at the southern border is a humanitarian crisis. The trafficking of human beings is a crisis. Using human beings as chattel, that is a crisis. Putting people into indentured servitude and slavery,
Chattel's property,
that
by the way.
is a crisis. And who has lied about this repeatedly to the Senate, to the House, is Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. And who voted for it? Every Democrat on that side of the aisle that refused to let this trial come forward, each and every one You are responsible for this not coming to light. It is a dereliction of your constitutional duty and a responsibility. Yes, it is a responsibility that we as members have to make certain that the American people know what happened today.
I heard that beach wall
Thank
is
you, Senator
actually like a
Blackburn.
bunker. I don't know if
Another
that's true.
great
Maybe
mind
not.
we've all benefited from in the Senate is our friend and colleague. This is
Spilled his phone.
junior senator from Florida. Before he
Marco
became
Rubio.
the senator from Florida, Senator Scott was previously Governor Scott.
That's right. He's the junior senator.
Governor of one of
Marco
the
Rubio is the
most
senior.
heavily
It's
populated
funny.
states in America. And prior to that, he's famous in the business world.
For holding
Personally
the
employing
record for
hundreds of
pleading the
thousands of
fifth
people.
the most amount of
The
times.
Department of
I think
Homeland
he holds the
Security
record for
is
pleading
an
the fifth.
enormous organization. Nobody understands how best to run an enormous organization and to do so with exceptional skill better than Senator Scott, and nobody understands better than him how the buck stops with the person running that organization. We'd love to hear from him now.
I want to thank my colleague from Utah for his commitment to the rule of law, his commitment to the Constitution, all of his efforts today, and every day he's been up here to make sure that the Senate follows the Constitution, doesn't set precedents that don't make any sense, and today is a horrible day. So I also want to thank my colleague from Wisconsin for
Scott's better when he's not reading.
being such a voice on making sure that the public actually knows what's going on here. The information he puts out, the charts he uses, the information he has gives everybody an idea what's actually going on. So, but unfortunately today, Democrats' assault on American democracy had a banner day. Democrats in the Senate said that impeachments by the United States House of Representatives don't matter anymore. You have to have a trial, they don't matter. According to what Democrats did today, we don't need to hold impeachment trials here in the Senate ever. This is a horrible precedent. It's not what the Constitution envisioned. It doesn't matter if, for example, you're a cabinet secretary and that you've instructed your agency to ignore the law and not execute the
I think
laws
the
of the
reason
United
people
States.
thought it was a bunker
doesn't matter
in Delaware and his beach
if I
house is
order an
because it was
agency
like
to
a
ignore the
top
laws of the
secret
United States,
seawall,
Americans are murdered.
something like that.
They
That's what it
are.
was filed
They
as.
have been. It doesn't matter if by order an agency ignore the laws
No,
of
if you're gonna
of the
stimulate
United
people's
States, deadly
imaginations,
fentanyl
you're
pours into
gonna-
our communities and poisons our
You
children
get that kind of thing.
and our grandchildren. It doesn't matter if by order an agency ignore the laws of the United States, terrorists on the FBI terrorist watch list, and migrants with known gang affiliations stream into our country.
No, so
Such an extent that the FBI
you can
director
plead it. I
testified
think
sitting
you know
right next
as long as it
to
makes
Secretary
sense.
Mayorkas before Congress that this is the most
So, for
dangerous time
instance,
in America since 9/11.
On my channel, I went through Jeffrey Epstein's deposition.
Stop and think about it before you
I
comment
might
for a
just
second.
Google it because I don't know off the top of my head how many times he
Think
put
about
the
either your
fifth.
mom or your dad, your spouse, your brother or your sister, a child or a grandchild, niece or nephew. Just think of one of them. Just pick one of them.
There might be an answer.
You cherish, you love them. You can think of wonderful things about them. Now, for thousands of American families, that person that you're thinking about today is dead. Let me say it again.
So Newsmax is the
For
trusted
thousands
source
of
these
American
days.
families, the person
Don't
that
ask.
you're thinking about today
I'm hoping to get picked up by. No, I'm just kidding. Independent
taken too
news
soon
source
by the
right
deadly
here.
fentanyl crisis.
I don't want anybody
that has
telling me I
ravaged our
can't goof
nation because
off
of the wide open southern border.
shenanigans and such.
Look, every one of us knows some family that has been ripped apart by the deadly fentanyl crisis. Everybody does. Some of us have been impacted directly. Fentanyl is killing 70,000 people a year. That's 70,000 families that are torn apart because we have an open southern border. This is happening in part because instead of letting our brave Border Patrol do their job and stop these deadly drugs, Secretary Mayorkas intentionally is using them to let even more people illegally cross the border and come to our country and get all sorts of nice services. They get phones, they get lawyers, they get hotel rooms, all paid for by the U.S. taxpayer. Every victim of Secretary Mayorkas' order for his agency has a name. Everybody's got, I mean, just think about that family member. I've heard a lot of heartbreaking stories from people at my house, or at my home state. Florida families are feeling the impact of this administration's lawless border crisis every single day. Deadly fentanyl, criminals, terrorists.
Chambers clearing out. It was full. And then,
pour across Biden's open border.
It's hard to get it that
This is all intentional. There are 1,145 children between 14 and 18 years old who died from fentanyl in 2021. So that's like having a classroom of kids die every week. Every week.
No comment.
In 2022, I heard from a mom in Kissimmee, just outside Orlando, where
Big Pharma.
her son was in the Air Force, and he had a bright future in the Air Force. He came home to surprise her on Mother's Day weekend. He unfortunately visited an old friend who he didn't know had been dealing drugs. The friend convinced the young man to take a Xanax, which was unknowingly laced with fentanyl.
Jeez.
The mom found him dead. Came home to just surprise her for her birthday. He's dead. Put yourself in position.
It is
that
6
mom.
p.m. here.
What is she thinking about today? What is
I'm
she
going to
thinking
have
about when she
to
watches this
call it
unfold?
soon. I don't want to. I
Every
enjoy
Democrat
this.
says,
Never thought
"The
I'd
guy
stream
that
and
made
people
the
would be
decision
here with me. But hey, it happened.
Open the southern border will not be held accountable.
I have to run.
26-year-old
Do I have
Ashley
to?
Dunn is another American who was
3:02
lost to
there.
fentanyl poisoning. Ashley's mother, Josephine Dunn, says their daughter did not
Chat.
overdose.
Let me give you
but was
the link if you want to
poisoned
continue to
by one
watch.
half of one
I already
Percocet
dropped it, but
tablet
just
that
in
was
case you
counterfeit.
don't have it. If it's up there too
According
far.
to Ms. Dunn, her daughter was
I really
murdered
appreciate everybody popping in,
products
joining
made
me.
in
It's
Mexico
been so much fun. I could
that
keep
were
going,
welcomed into
but I
this
have
country
kids.
by Mayorkas and his
They need me.
Today's Senate
So,
Democrats made certain
as
that
I always say,
Secretary Mayorkas will never have to answer.
knowledge is power. Subscribe for more.
He's
Thank you
never-
so
he's
much.
never gonna answer
I really
for
really
Ashley's
mean
death.
that from the bottom of my heart. It's
never
been
have
like,
to answer for
been like a little
any other
dream come
deaths.
true, this growth here.
But you know what?
Thank you, really.
We'll know what he did.
And here's the link. I think I'll, yep, it's right there.
People know
And if you
too
want to keep
much what he
watching,
did.
go there and watch.
We'll
Take
never,
care.
ever.
Thank you. Again,
Never
take care and be
get away
well.
with this. America is a more dangerous place because Mayorkas and Biden have allowed criminals, drugs, terrorists,